Chapter 1. The unquiet hour. It was upon a chill October evening in the year 1093 that I found myself once again by the glowing hearth of our rooms at 221B Baker Street, listening to the distant clatter of hansom cabs over the slick cobblestones below. A mist hung low over London that night, wrapping the city in its damp, spectral folds, so that the gas lamps glimmered like pale stars seen through a shroud. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his eyes half-lidded in what seemed a state of languid indifference. Yet I, who had watched that countenance through many a curious hour, knew well that behind that serene mask lay a mind in fierce activity, as a blade kept sheathed until the duel began. The crackling of the fire, the distant sound of hooves, and the occasional bark of a costermonger completed the nocturnal symphony to which we had grown so accustomed. "You are uncommonly silent tonight, Holmes," said I, laying down the lancet which I had been perusing in vain. "No new case has arrived to disturb your response?" His gray eyes flickered towards me with the faintest amusement. "My dear Watson," he replied, "I observe that you mistake stillness for stagnation. I am, at this moment, engaged in the solution of no fewer than 3 matters, each invisible to your medical eye, though they clamor most noisily for my attention." "3 matters," I exclaimed, "and yet not a single client has passed that door today." "Precisely," said he, with that dry satisfaction which often accompanied his most perverse displays of logic. "It is astonishing how much of human behavior is imprinted upon paper, if one has but the wit to read it. The left-hand column of the Times, the advertisement pages of the Daily Telegraph, and a certain irregularity in the city weather report have been ample fuel for the day." Before I could press him for details of these invisible intrigues, a sharp, urgent knock rattled the door below, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up, announcing a visitor. The next moment the door burst open, and a man stepped inside, his face pale and his eyes wide with agitation. He was a man of middle years, well dressed in a dark frock coat that had seen better days, and his hat, still glistening with the evening's mist, trembled slightly in his hands. Holmes did not rise. Instead, he fixed the newcomer with his hawk-like gaze. "Pray be seated, sir," said Holmes, indicating the armchair beside the fire. "You have come to consult us, I perceive, and in some haste." The man collapsed into the chair with a sigh of mingled relief and anxiety. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "And this is Dr. Watson," he added, with a courteous gesture toward me. "Now, sir, you have the advantage of us in name only. My name is Alfred Pemberton, and I am or was a clerk in the firm of Calthorpe and Amp, Green, bridge surveyors of the city. But I come to you not about my employment, but about a matter so strange, so alarming, that Scotland Yard has thrown up its hands in bewilderment. I was told that if anyone could shed light upon it, it would be you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes brightened a shade. "Scotland Yard and bewilderment is always a most promising prologue," he murmured. "Pray proceed, Mr. Pemberton." The man leaned forward, his voice lowering, as though he feared the fog might carry his words into the night. "It concerns the marble bridge, that new span across the Thames near Blackfriars. As you may know, it was opened to the public only this summer. 3 nights ago, at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, a night watchman by the name of Samuel Briggs reported hearing footsteps echoing across the bridge, though the structure was empty to the eye. He described them as measured, deliberate, as of a man walking with purpose. "Perhaps the sound carried from elsewhere," I suggested. Mr. Pemberton shook his head. He thought so too at first, but when he advanced toward the sound, the footsteps seemed to move away, always just beyond his sight, until they ceased abruptly at the center of the bridge. There he found something most disturbing, a single white glove, soaked through with river water, resting upon the parapet. Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "The following night," Pemberton continued, "a constable stationed nearby heard the same uncanny tread. When he reached the bridge's center, he saw, or believed he saw, a figure in white, gliding along the walkway, only to vanish at the midpoint. His description was of a man in antiquated dress, with a broad-brimmed hat and a cloak that seemed to ripple though there was no wind. The fellow is no fool. He's a decorated man with 10 years' service, and yet when others arrived moments later, there was nothing save the sound of the river and a faint scent of lavender." Holmes tapped the tips of his fingers together. "And on the 3rd night?" he asked quietly. Pemberton swallowed. "On the 3rd night, sir, a body was found, a young woman, her name as yet unknown. She had apparently fallen from the bridge, but the strange part is that no one saw her enter. The night was still. The watchmen were alert after the prior disturbances. Yet at dawn she was pulled from the water, a broken neck and one bare hand. the other still gloved in white, the mate to the glove found the first night. A profound stillness settled over the room. Even the fire seemed to hesitate in its crackling. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he stood staring into the flames. "This is excellent," he said at last. "Truly excellent. A ghost upon a bridge, a missing identity, a vanishing figure, and the Yard at a loss. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, what have the authorities concluded?" "Why, nothing at all," Pemberton said miserably. "Inspector Lestrade himself believes it to be the work of some madman haunting the bridge for sport or worse. They have increased patrols, but last night nothing occurred. The newspapers are on the verge of hysteria. The Evening Gazette has dubbed it the ghost of the Marble Bridge." Holmes turned suddenly, his face animated. "And you, Mr. Pemberton?" "Why come to me?" "Because, Mr. Holmes," the man whispered, "I was the engineer's assistant on that bridge. I know every bolt and girder of it, and I tell you no human being could disappear at its center. There is no door, no recess, no trick of structure. If a man stood upon that span, he must be seen. And yet he was not." Holmes finished for him. "Very well. Watson, we have been idle for too long. Mr. Pemberton, we shall visit the Marble Bridge tonight." The man blinked. "Tonight, Mr. Holmes?" But, Holmes interrupted, "the ghost will expect its audience. Midnight is its theater, and fog its curtain. You may rely upon us." As Pemberton departed into the swirling mist, Holmes took up his Inverness cape and violin case. I had seen that look in his eye before, that peculiar mingling of sardonic amusement and keen predatory interest. "Watson," he said, tightening the clasp on his cloak, "there are no ghosts upon the Thames. But there may be a murderer clever enough to appear as one." And so it was that, a few hours later, beneath the shrouded sky of London, we found ourselves rattling through the fog in a hansom cab toward the Marble Bridge, unaware of the strange and perilous chain of events into which we were about to step. Chapter the second. The client's statement and Holmes's first deductions in the gray interlude between our visitor's departure and the appointed hour. Baker Street settled into that peculiar stillness I have often observed before one of our night, for is an air of anticipatory calm, like that which falls upon a theater before the curtain rises. Holmes, who might in such periods be found stretched upon the sofa in a semblance of torpor, was on this occasion unusually brisk. He drew the curtains against the fog's dim tap at the panes, set the violin aside with reluctance, and began to marshal upon the table a small arrangement of instruments and oddments that constituted, I knew, the portable arsenal of his profession. Among these were a lantern of uncommon intensity, which he had modified with a tight shutter to cast a pencil of light, a pocket lens of very clear glass, a pair of fine forceps of measuring tape with curious notches of his own contriving, a dark, wafer-thin disc that I recognized as a mirror for reflecting a glint along low surfaces, and a little file whose label bore in his neat hand the words "oxalic stain." He examined each with the affectionate care a cavalryman affords his saber. "You prepare for a campaign," I observed. "The enemy is more subtle than a saber," he returned. "Light, magnification, and proportion, Watson, that Trinity defeats more villains than pistols ever have. There is a fourth that I, smiling, for our long friendship emboldened me to tease him on occasion. Your conceit." He laughed softly. "Touché. But you mistake confidence and method for pride and self. Had I invented the facts of the world, I would indeed be insufferable. As it is, I am only grateful they consent to be read." He crossed to the mantel and stood a moment gazing at the coal's red heart. "You noted our client's hands? Anxious, certainly. They trembled. Trembling is the outward signal. I mean the hands themselves. Ink smears under the second fingernail of the right hand, a paler band at the base of the ring finger, an irregular callus upon the left thumb, and a faint discoloration upon the cuff where a plumb-line's dust would brush. He was indeed what he professed, a clerk and draftsman, lately married or lately bereaved of a ring, and given to weekend errands on the South Bank, for the discoloration is not of office soot, but of Limmer River works, Watson." "You astonish me," said I, though in truth I had long since ceased to be astonished, except in the manner of the willing pupil who finds renewed delight in the master's precision. "And the pace of his breathing? Rapid, but not from the stairs." He paused on the landing. "It is fear pressed down by duty. We shall be kind to Mr. Pemberton. He will not tell us everything, not yet, but he will tell us enough." "Not tell us everything? What, then, is withheld?" "Motives," said Holmes, lightly. "Not his, perhaps, but another's. The ghost is a mask, and masks are fashioned for an audience. The question is for whom?" He was interrupted by the sound of boots upon the stair. The door opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade, his sharp features pinched by the cold, his coat slick with the fog's fine moisture. He cast his habitual mixture of suspicion and reluctant goodwill over the room. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Doctor," he added with a nod to me. I thought I'd look in on the off chance you'd heard of the tomfoolery at the Marble Bridge. If you mean to meddle, and you usually do, you might as well have the yard's blessing from the start." "My dear Lestrade," Holmes replied, with that indolent courtesy he reserves for old sparring partners, "I prefer your blessings to your handcuffs. Pray for it. You have been upon the river?" "Since noon," said Lestrade, rubbing his hands before the fire, though he did not sit. "Nothing more to be got from the water. The girls at St. Saviour's mortuary, no papers, no purse. We've circulated the description. There's talk of closing the bridge after dark to pacify the public." "A singular cure," Holmes murmured. "To shutter a span because it is haunted. What about the glove?" "In my evidence room," said Lestrade, a trifle defensively. "The constable's story is in the book. Footsteps, a figure all in a sort of white, then nothing. The watchman sticks to the steps in the glove. I dare say some wag is dressing up to frighten them. And as for the lady, well, women do desperate things at night." "Some do," Holmes agreed, "though very few carry lavender." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Lavender?" Holmes lifted a finger to his own sleeve. The constable noted a faint scent, no more than a suggestion. "I dare say if we sniffed your evidence room we would smell half the chemist's register. No matter. Will you join us upon the bridge, Inspector?" Lestrade shifted, hesitated, then shook his head. "I've got men posted and a sergeant waiting, but I must be at the station for a magistrate in the morning. I thought only to warn you. Keep the theatrics out of the papers. The city's nerves are like eels tonight." He turned to go and paused. "If you fetch me a name for the girl, you'll have done a kindness." Holmes bowed him out. When the door had closed, he glanced at the clock. 11:30. "Our cab will be here at the quarter. Until then, amuse me, Watson." "With what?" "A problem. Consider the following. A man walks upon a bridge and is not seen to leave it. There are no trapdoors, no recesses. Our client insists upon the fact. The constable, an honest man, sees a figure that vanishes. The watchman hears steps without a body to cast them. What explanations present themselves to a reasonable medical mind?" "Delusion," I began. "The fog lends itself to phantoms, or echoes a sound bending in strange ways over water. As for the figure in albino cloak or sheet carried by a gust might seem like a man in such light. Or," he smiled, "you will still be a tolerable logician. Continue. Or a man disguised and swift of foot, slipping past the watchers when they turn toward the center. Or a boat someone gaining the parapet and lowering himself by rope to a skiff below, then casting off. But the watchman would have heard the splash or the creak of oarlocks, unless—" I paused, for a thought, odd but not impossible, occurred to me. "Unless he wore India rubber soles and the boat's oarlocks were muffled." Holmes, who had resumed his chair, clapped his hands once, softly. "Bravissimo. You supply me the instrument. I shall compose the tune. Our difficulty lies not in contriving an escape, but in reconciling the sequence footfall, glove, figure, body over 3 nights. It is rarely the marvel that puzzles me, Watson, but the calendar." Before I could reply, the bell jangled below, and presently the cabman's tread sounded upon the step. Holmes gathered his apparatus with a surgeon's economy of movement, and we descended to the street, where the fog had thickened into a clammy pall, blurring the lamps to yellow moons. We drove in silence, the cab's lamps cutting tunnels through the murk, while the Thames, when at last we drew near it, proclaimed its presence with a colder breath, and that vast, ceaseless whisper which is the river's own. The marble bridge, so named for its pale cladding, though its bones, I had been told, were iron rose from the shrouded banks like a spectral causeway. At each corner stood a lamp upon a fluted column, and midway, where the span was highest, a pair of lion masks disgorged the rain into the river by hidden channels. A constable hailed us as we alighted. He was a compact man with a neat mustache, and he introduced himself as Sergeant Milliton. "Inspector said you might be by, sir. Quiet tonight, Mr. Holmes, too quiet, if you take my meaning. The watchman's in his hut there." He indicated a little shelter near the north approach, where a figure sat hunched over a brazier. "Briggs?" Holmes asked. "Aye, Samuel Briggs. He's none the worse for the fright, though he's made a great to-do of the glove." "Quite right that he did," said Holmes, and there was a caressing irony in his tone that the sergeant perhaps overlooked. "We shall begin at the center. Watson, the lantern." The 3 of us moved along the walkway, our footfalls muffled by the fog. It was as if London had drawn the bedding up to its eyes, and left only the cold nose of the river to the air. Holmes walked a pace before us, head bent, his lantern's narrow beam traveling in measured arcs over the paving. At the midpoint he stopped, knelt, and laid his palm upon the stone. "Dry where it should be damp," he said softly, "and damp where it should be dry." Curious. To my untrained senses the stones were uniformly clammy. Holmes opened the shutter a fraction and let the beam rake along the parapet. The pale surface of the marble, streaked here and there with soot, and the faint pitting of the weather, acquired under that slice of light a revelatory quality. as if it were a page where some faint note had been erased. There, he breathed. I leaned closer. Upon the inner lip of the parapet, where one's glove might rest while peering down, were minute scratches, set at a shallow angle, as if a fine hook had been drawn lightly along the stone more than one. Below them, far fainter, a thread-like line of scoring traced a half-curve toward the lion mask's drain. A line and a pivot, Holmes murmured. Sergeant, your constable who scented lavender, was his name Wallace? It was, sir. And is Wallace a man who smokes the little Turkish cigarettes sold by Jessop's off the commercial road? Militant blinked. I couldn't say. Holmes's nostrils dilated the merest fraction. Nor need you. He does. He leaned here, the ember near the stall. The ash is there, caught by the lip. No, do not touch it. Good. The watchman's glove rested in this very place the first night, for there was a faint ring where wet leather met dust. We begin to see the playbill. Watson, a first act that leaves a prop, a second that conjures an apparition, a third that ends with a body, the fourth, we shall try to prevent it. Do you suppose, I asked, that the lady, poor soul, was acquainted with the author of this drama? If she was not, Holmes said, rising, then he had a more intimate knowledge of her than the registers of acquaintance commonly allow. You will note the absence of grit in the scoring, no sand caught in the cuts. That marks the instrument as new or seldom used, and the angle so slight suggests it was drawn by someone standing a little below the level of the walkway. Below? I repeated, startled. Then there was a boat. Not a boat, he said, with that feline light in his eye. Or not only a boat. Watson, consider the lion. The river passes through its throat by an unseen channel. An energetic man with a workable scheme might use the antiquarian ornament as more than decoration. I would like to meet the mason who set it. We spent the better part of an hour upon that spot, Holmes measuring, peering, and once even lying upon his stomach to let the lantern's ray graze the stone so narrowly that the scratches stood up like hairs. Sergeant Militant, who had the practical patience of his kind, answered questions as they were asked and asked none in return. At last Holmes seemed satisfied. He replaced the lantern in its leather case and turned to the shelter, where the watchman Briggs had emerged to stamp the cold from his feet. Briggs was a long, melancholy fellow with a nose like an axe and eyes red from smoke. He touched his brow when addressed. You heard the steps, Mr. Briggs? Holmes said gently. I did, sir, plain as you like. Coming from T South End, slow-like, and not a soul in sight. Echoes, the inspector says. But I know the echoes of this bridge, as I know my own bones, and these were footsteps, right enough. And the glove? It was layin' just where you're standin' now, sir, only half upon the parapet, as if someone had put it there to dry, but it was sodden. Strange thing to find, sir, for there'd been no one to wear it. Holmes nodded, as if this confirmed some private theorem. You did well to keep your head. One last question. On the second night, did the constable say whether the figure in white cast a shadow? Briggs scratched his ear. He said it was like a pale shape in mist, sir. Didn't say nothin' o' shadows. Just so. Thank you. He turned to Militant. Sergeant, indulge me in a small request. Keep the men at the approaches, and leave the center alone for an hour. If anything occurs, it will occur when watched from a distance not hovered over. Militant eyed him. Very well, Mr. Holmes. I'll be 50 yards off with Jenkins. Shout, and we'll come. When they had withdrawn into the fog, Holmes drew me aside. We shall place ourselves there, Watson, just by the lion. Don't look as if you are watching the center. Fix your gaze upon the water, and, above all, if you hear steps without a body, do not be alarmed. You expect them? I do. We have had the prologue in 3 acts. The author is economical. He will not waste a set. And our author has rehearsed. Ready? We took our positions, side by side at the parapet, our shoulders nearly brushing the cold mane of the stone lion. The fog pressed close to us, so that the opposite bank was a mere rumor of gaslight. Time in such a place, an hour, loses its accustomed shape. It stretches, thins, gathers into small pools. Around stray sounds the drip from a cable, the faint clank of a chain far below, the sibilant whisper of water licking stone. My breath made a milky wreath before me. Holmes is how well I knew it. Went out in scarce visible threads. Then, very softly, as if the bridge had grown a heart and learned to beat, came the footsteps. A single tread, then another. Measured, deliberate, unhurried. They sounded not behind us nor before us, but so, it seemed, within the very substance of the span, as though a man strode along the hidden marrow of the bridge, while the empty surface mocked our eyes. I confess that a chill, distinct from the river's damp, crept along my spine. I looked involuntarily at Holmes. He did not stir. His head inclined the merest fraction, like a hound catching the true wind. The steps drew nearer. Near paused and resumed beyond us, toward the very center where, 3 nights before, the glove had lain. Steady, Watson, he breathed. The steps halted at the midpoint. For a moment there was nothing, only the thinning fog, the black tremor of the water, and my own pulse, which sounded indecently loud to my ears. And then, out of the whitening murk, a pale shape distilled a man's figure, or the idea of a man, clothed in a long, light-colored cloak, with a brim of some sort low upon the brow. It glided rather than walked, pausing where the parapet curved. I could not swear to a face nor to my hands. It seemed as bodiless as a reflection, and yet it stood where no reflection can stand. Holmes's fingers touched my sleeve, a gentle pressure. "Attend," he whispered, so softly that the words scarcely existed. The shape turned its head as if to regard the lion's mouth. There was, I fancied, a faint motion there, a darker thread against pale stone. The shape leaned, dwindled as a cloud thins and was gone. A shout broke from Sergeant Milliton at the north end hoy, and the quick drumming of boots came from the south. Holmes did not shout. He sprang to the parapet, flashed his lantern once, twice into the lion's mouth, and then had his hand thrust up to the wrist, into the aperture, above the bronze jaw. He gave a short exclamation of satisfaction, wrenched, and brought out into the beam's circle a length of fine waxed cord ending in a tiny iron grapnel, its claws polished to needle brightness. "Enough for tonight," he said calmly, as the sergeant panted up. "No ghosts, Milliton, only mechanism. Keep your men back. The air is full of traps." "Traps," gasped the sergeant. "But the footsteps, Mr. Holmes." We all heard them. Holmes cocked his head, as if listening to a secret, faraway music. "A man who writes plays for the ear may care very little about what the eye sees. There are tunnels within the bridge for drainage and maintenance. Sound travels in curious fashion along such throats, especially if coaxed by but let us not reveal the trick to a half-lit stage." He slipped the grapnel and cord into his pocket. "We have the how of the apparition's entrance and exit. Tomorrow we shall have the who and the why. For tonight, Sergeant, post a man to watch this lion's mouth, no one to approach within 10 paces. Watson, you perceive the value of a scratch and a scent? Lavender is a coward's cologne, it lingers where courage will not." As we turned back toward the cab, the river breathing its dark breath beneath us, I ventured, "You believe, then, that our poor unknown lady was lured to this spot by the same device?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that she was brought to this spot, whether by her own steps or another's arrangement, that an understage exists beneath our feet, and that the play's impresario has a talent for rehearsal. He made us hear a man where there was none, see a figure where there was only craft and vapor. Such a one rehearses every cue, including the body's fall. Then will he attempt it again?" Holmes's profile, keen as a drawn rapier against the fog, inclined. "Not if we alter the script. But to alter it, we must first read it entirely. Tomorrow, we shall call upon the firm of Calthorpe and Amp Green and ask to see the bridge's plans, and we must learn the lady's name. Names, Watson, are keys in London, as in all labyrinths." He settled into the cab, drawing the door to. As the driver clucked to the horse and we rolled away, I looked back at the pallid sweep of the marble bridge, where the lamps burned like tired guardians, and the lion's stone face gleamed coldly above the black water. The fog closed rank behind us, but in my mind's eye I saw again the pale figure, the whispering steps, and my friend's hand disappearing up to the wrist into the beast's ancient throat, to draw forth a thread as thin as death and as strong. "Holmes," I said, "if there are no ghosts upon the Thames, there are at least men who take pains to resemble them." "Just so," he replied, "and men who take pains leave signs for those who take pains to look. Sleep if you can, my dear fellow. Tomorrow we engage not only the specter of the marble bridge, but the human hand that programs its walk." With that, he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The city, muffled and immense, flowed around our little cab like a dark tide, and I, who have known terror in many forms, felt not fear, but a tightening of the heart's core, the sensation that comes when a game of high stakes has just begun, and one's partner is a master of the board. Chapter the third. Blueprints and secrets. The following morning broke with a raw, colorless dawn. The fog not dispersed, but settled low upon the city like a weary guest reluctant to depart. As we made our way by cab toward Calthorpe and Amp Green, the firm of bridge surveyors for whom Mr. Alfred Pemberton worked, Holmes sat opposite me, his gaze fixed upon the blurred landscape beyond the rattling window. His long, thin fingers were pressed together beneath his chin, his expression remote, yet every now and then a spark flitted across his gray eyes, like the sudden gleam of steel glimpsed beneath cloth. "You are preoccupied," I ventured. "My dear Watson," he murmured, "when one stands at the edge of a puzzle and sees the faintest outline of its shape, one must tread carefully. Too swift a stride, and one tramples the very footprints that lead within. And what shape do you perceive?" He smiled faintly. "A structure built for the crossing of men, employed for the vanishing of one. A lion's mouth concealing more than rain. A ghost that treads with human cunning. and a dead woman whose presence upon that bridge remains, as yet, unpenciled upon the draftsman's plan. A curious design, is it not? Before I could reply, the cab jolted to a halt before a sober building in the city. 4 stories of soot-darkened brick, with tall, narrow windows, and a polished brass plate inscribed Calthorpe and Amp Green, civil engineers and surveyors. Inside, the air smelled of ink, chalk, and damp timber. A chorus of clerks bent over their ledgers looked up briefly as we entered, then lowered their heads again, like a flock disturbed. A young man in spectacles approached. "Mr. Pemberton awaits you, gentlemen," he said, and ushered us through a corridor lined with framed maps of the Thames bridges, weirs, embankments, and the intricate veins of London's lifeblood. At the end, a door opened upon a drafting room, flooded with the wan light of morning. There, amidst great sloping tables strewn with compasses, T-squares, and crisp blueprints, stood Mr. Pemberton, looking somewhat less distraught than the previous night, but with a lingering anxiety that hung about him like a half-buttoned coat. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming," he said earnestly. "I took the liberty of withdrawing the original marble bridge plans from the archives, as you requested." Holmes inclined his head. "Excellent. Show me, if you please." Pemberton led us to a vast oak table upon which was unfurled a series of blueprints, their fine lines inked with the meticulous care of professional draftsmen. The bridge appeared in elevation, cross-section, and plan a marvel of late Victorian engineering. A graceful iron span clad in pale marble, with hollow drainage channels running through the interior, emerging at the mouths of 4 great stone lions. Holmes bent over the drawings with the intensity of a chess master studying the board. His lens was out in a moment, his finger tracing certain faint dotted lines that ran parallel to the parapet. "These channels," he said abruptly, "they run the length of the bridge beneath the walkway?" "Yes, sir," said Pemberton. 2 main drainage tunnels, accessible by narrow inspection hatches at either end. The rain flows through small apertures along the parapet and is carried off through the lions into the river. Holmes's lips tightened slightly. "And they are tall enough for a man to crawl within?" Pemberton hesitated. "Barely. 2 feet at the widest. A man might move through them if he were slender and determined, but it would be most uncomfortable. Yet not impossible. No, sir, not impossible." Holmes straightened suddenly. "And these inspection hatches, are they secured?" "By iron locks," Pemberton replied. "Only workmen and inspectors have keys." "Who has access to those keys?" Holmes asked softly. The clerk flushed. "The foreman, Mr. James Bixby, the chief engineer, Mr. Green himself, and myself, sir." Holmes's eyes lingered upon him for a fraction longer than comfort allowed. "Indeed," he said at last. "And has any key gone missing?" "Not to my knowledge," Pemberton said, a shade too quickly. "We keep careful inventory." Holmes gave no sign of disbelief, but I, who had grown accustomed to the minute fluctuations of his mood, noticed the slightest upward twitch of his right eyebrow. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said, "were there any unusual visitors or contractors during the bridge's final stages of construction? Men not ordinarily on the payroll?" Pemberton frowned, searching his memory. "There was, yes, now you mention it, a Mr. Albert Wendell, a private subcontractor. He supplied decorative fittings, marble facings, drainage grates, and the lion carvings themselves. An eccentric fellow, wore lavender water, I remember, and always complained of the river air ruining his clothes." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Lavender, you say?" "Yes, a strong scent of it, always. He was fond of dramatic gestures, too. Insisted on supervising the fitting of the lions himself. I thought it odd at the time, but Mr. Green allowed it Wendell was well recommended. Where might this gentleman be found?" I don't rightly know, sir. His letters came from a lodging in Lambeth, but whether he still resides there, I cannot say." Holmes tapped the blueprint lightly with the head of his pencil. "Mr. Wendell supervised the lion fittings. The grapnel we discovered was anchored within the lion's throat. He wore lavender, and he had legitimate access to the understructure during construction. Most instructive." He turned to Pemberton with sudden briskness. "One more matter. Did you know the deceased woman?" Pemberton blinked. "The woman? No, sir. I read of her only this morning in the papers. The Yard has not yet identified her." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if some inner calculation had aligned. "Then we must pay our respects to St. Saviour's mortuary. The dead, Watson, are often less reticent than the living." The mortuary visit an hour later, we found ourselves walking the drafty corridors of St. Saviour's, where the river's chill seemed to cling even to the stone walls. The attendant, a solemn man in a frayed black coat, led us into a long, narrow chamber, where 6 shrouded forms lay upon iron tables. The smell of disinfectant mingled with something heavier, older. He pulled back the sheet from the young woman's face. I confess, though I had witnessed death often in my medical service, something in that pale visage struck me with particular force. She was of perhaps 25, well-featured, with delicate hands. Her clothing was of good quality, though water-stained, and her hair, rich chestnut, had been neatly braided. Holmes examined her not with ghoulish curiosity, but with a cold, almost surgical detachment. He lifted her right hand, the one that still bore a white glove now stained by the river than the bare left, noting the faint impression of a ring long since removed. He peered closely at her ears and neckline, then at the soles of her shoes. She was not a vagrant, I said softly. Those are fine boots, well made. Indeed, said Holmes, and recently polished, though the heels are worn on the outer edge a countrywoman's gait, accustomed to uneven paths. Notice also the faint bruising on the upper arm finger marks. She did not fall of her own accord, she was seized. The attendant crossed himself. Holmes leaned closer to the woman's left ear. Watson, observe this faint trace of powder, not chalk. And here, upon the hem of her skirt chalk dust, unmistakably. She visited a place where marble or limestone is cut, a workshop perhaps. He straightened abruptly, or a sculptor's yard. Wendell, I murmured. Just so. Holmes's quiet certainty as we left the mortuary. Holmes's steps quickened, his cloak billowing behind him like a dark sail catching the wind. The streets were still half shrouded in mist, but his mind was already racing ahead of the day. Watson, he said, the marble bridge is not haunted. It is staged. The footsteps acoustic trickery, the ghost cloak, fog, and calculated misdirection. The grapnel and access point to the understructure, and the dead woman an unwilling participant drawn, by force or deceit, to the very heart of the stage. And Wendell? A man who scented himself with lavender while embedding grapnels inside lions' throats. Holmes said grimly. Either he is the stage manager or one of his actors. But mark me, this is not some prankster's delight. There is calculation here, Watson. Rehearsal. 3 nights of performance, each increasing in daring, and a corpse as the final act. Whoever the perpetrator is, he has a purpose yet unfulfilled. He hailed a cab with a sharp whistle. We must find Wendell, and quickly. Chapter the 4th. The first suspect the fog had lifted by the following afternoon, though a pale, persistent drizzle fell upon London with the dreary regularity of a metronome. The streets glistened like damp slate, and the horses' hooves beat a steady tattoo along the thoroughfares. We had scarcely finished our luncheon when Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, his boots muddy, his collar turned up, and an expression upon his narrow face that I knew well part triumph, part caution. Like a man holding a hand of cards he suspects may not be quite as strong as he hopes. Holmes received him with his usual languid courtesy, though I saw the quick glint of interest in his gray eyes. Lestrade declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea, removed his damp gloves, and stood by the fire, rubbing his hands together, as though to warm both his body and his narrative. Well, Mr. Holmes, he began with restrained satisfaction, I fancy the Yard has got ahead of you this time. We've made an arrest in the Marble Bridge case. Holmes leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers beneath his chin. Indeed? He said mildly. I am a positive learner. Pray, enlighten us. Lestrade permitted himself a thin smile. A man named James Bixby, foreman of the bridge works. He had access to the inspection hatches and keys. He's of a wiry build. And more to the point, he's been seen meeting the deceased woman on several occasions near the southern end of the bridge. The watchman Briggs recognized them both together a fortnight ago, late at night. We traced her identity through a dressmaker's label. Her name was Miss Clara Lewes, a milliner from Southwark. Bixby was her intimate friend by all accounts, though recently they quarreled bitterly. Jealousy? I ventured. Exactly, Doctor, Lestrade said, pleased. He was heard to say she'd pay for her lies only days before her death. When we searched his lodgings this morning, what did we find but a coil of waxed cord, the very likeness of that you showed me last night, Mr. Holmes, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Furthermore, his boots match a partial print found upon the wet parapet of the bridge. Holmes closed his eyes, as though listening to a distant symphony. Fascinating, he murmured. Lestrade mistook this for approval and pressed on. We brought him in for questioning at dawn. He turned pale as death when we produced the cord, and though he denies everything, he's in no position to explain away that evidence. Motive, means, opportunity, it's all there. Holmes opened his eyes. They were very bright now. And where is Mr. Bixby at present? At the station, awaiting formal charge, Lestrade replied. I thought, out of courtesy, I'd give you the news before it reached the evening papers. I dare say this is one case we'll close without any of your theatricals. Holmes gave a thin, unreadable smile. My dear Lestrade, I rejoice whenever Scotland Yard dispenses with my services. It permits me more time for my chemical analyses. And yet, before you rush to tie the bow upon your parcel, allow me a single question. How tall is Mr. Bixby? Lestrade blinked. 5'4", I should say. A wiry little fellow. Indeed, Holmes said softly. And the inspection tunnel of the Marble Bridge 2 feet at the widest, if memory serves. A man of Bixby's build might wriggle through, with some discomfort. But tell me, has he any mark upon his hands or knees consistent with recent passage through stone drains? Lestrade frowned. We didn't examine for that. Of course not, said Holmes, almost kindly. You have the cord, the quarrel, and the glove. It is quite sufficient for a headline. But facts, Lestrade, are stubborn creatures. You cannot arrest them with a warrant. The inspector stiffened. Are you suggesting we've taken the wrong man? I suggest nothing, Holmes replied lightly. I merely observe. Permit me, Watson. He rose, crossed to the side table where he kept his files, and drew out the blueprint of the bridge we had examined that morning. Unrolling it across the table, he beckoned Lestrade closer. Here, he said, pointing with his long finger, is the southern inspection hatch. Its opening is set beneath the walkway, accessible only by a vertical drop through an iron grating. It is rusted, and its bolts were last oiled at the time of construction 3 months ago. Last night, when I examined it with a lantern, I observed a fresh crescent scrape upon the inner lip of the hacha mark, made by metal under tension, not by boot. The grapnel cord was attached above, not below. Whoever moved through that channel did so from beneath the lion's mouth, not from the hatch. Now, Lestrade, tell me, if Bixby intended to commit murder, why would he trouble himself to stage 3 nights of ghostly apparitions before the act, rather than simply push the poor woman over in the dark? Lestrade opened his mouth, closed it, and scowled. Some murderers like their games. Some, Holmes agreed smoothly, but not jealous foremen with no flair for lavender. Lestrade repeated, baffled. Holmes waved it away. A trifling scent, Inspector. You may ignore, eat at your peril. I could not help but notice the way Lestrade's initial triumph began to wilt, as though placed too close to the fire. He shifted uneasily. Well, Bixby's in custody. If you have something better, Holmes, by all means produce it. In time, Holmes said serenely. For the moment, I suggest you do not cut the cord too short, lest you find yourself hanging by it. Interview with James Bixby. Holmes, to my surprise, proposed that we accompany Lestrade to the station that very afternoon to speak with Bixby ourselves. The inspector agreed, though with ill grace, perhaps hoping that Holmes might trip over his own cleverness. The man we found in the yard's interrogation room was slight, broad-shouldered but lean, with quick, intelligent eyes beneath a shock of dark hair. His hands were calloused and stained from labor, and he bore himself with a mixture of resentment and bewilderment. I've told them a dozen times, he burst out as we entered. I never harmed Clara. Yes, we quarreled, every man and woman does. But to say I killed her, God strike me if I did. Mr. Bixby, Holmes said gently, taking the seat opposite him, we are not here to condemn you, but to understand. May I see your hands? Bixby hesitated, then extended them. Holmes examined them closely, palms, knuckles, nails, then suddenly took Bixby by surprise by reaching for his knees. The foreman jerked back. What's this? Calm yourself, Holmes murmured, running his fingers over the fabric. He then turned to Lestrade. No abrasions, no gravel, no evidence of crawling through narrow tunnels. If he entered the bridge unseen, it was not by that route. Lestrade shifted irritably. He could have lowered a rope, could he? Holmes said. Then why the grapnel in the lion's throat? Why the staged footsteps? No, Lestrade. Our Mr. Bixby is a jealous man, yes, but a theatrical murderer? Bixby's eyes filled with weary defiance. I loved her, I did. She'd been keeping company with some fine gentleman, lately never told me who. Thought herself too good for me in the end, but I'd never have pushed her into that river. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze suddenly piercing. Mr. Bixby, did she ever mention the name Wendell to you? Bixby frowned. Wendell? One said he was a queer sort, came round the bridge, works now and again, talking to her like he'd known her years. Wore some sweet scent like a lady. She laughed about it, said he gave her the creeps. Holmes sat back, satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Bixby. You may rest easier than you have these past 24 hours. Lestrade exhaled sharply. Holmes, you'll ruin my case. You have no case, Holmes said pleasantly. You have a coil of cord that any workman might possess, a quarrel overheard by half the riverbank, and a man whose knees tell a different story than your charge sheet. If you like, you may keep him overnight. But the real author of this drama remains at large, and your ghost has not yet taken its final bow. Holmes's private observation, as we walked back to Baker Street through the light rain. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. I knew better than to interrupt. His mind, I could tell, was weaving threads unseen, plucking at motives like strings on his violin. At last he spoke. The yard is satisfied with a jealous lover. How tedious. But the ghost is not jealous. He is precise. He rehearses. He writes scenes. He planted the glove before the woman's death. He summoned witnesses to footsteps and pale cloaks. He used the lion's mouth as a stage trapdoor. Jealousy is raw, impulsive. This he tapped his Templey's architecture. And Wendell, ah, Wendell, A man of lavender and marble, with access to the lions. If he is not the ghost, Watson, then he is surely its sculptor. Chapter V. The hidden clue. It is one of the peculiarities of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes that at the very instant when his mind blazes hottest within, his outward man grows the most cool. In the hours that followed Lestrade's premature triumph and our interview with the hapless Bixby, I saw in Holmes none of that excited flutter, which in lesser natures masquerades as energy. Rather, he became deliberate to the point of languor. He smoked less than usual, spoke not at all except in brief interrogatories, and most telltale sign-tuned his violin twice, without playing a note. "Rest if you like, Watson," he said at length, in that indifferent tone which always meant a march at double time. "We will call at the bridge once more before dark, and then upon Southwark. There are two shadows I wish to measure, one upon stone, the other upon character." We set out just as the light began to fail. The day had not cleared, the sky lay low upon the city like a pewter lid, and a thin, windless drizzle lent to every surface a faint, treacherous glitter. By the time our cab drew up at the northern approach of the marble bridge, the lamps had already been kindled along the embankment, and a few cautious pedestrians, with collars up and umbrellas thrust forward like shields, glided over the pale sweep of the span. Sergeant Milliton, whose practical patience recommended him to Holmes, emerged from the shadow of the shelter as we alighted. "Quiet as a churchyard, gentlemen," said he. "No phantoms tonight." "Churchyards are not as quiet as you think, Sergeant," Holmes returned, with a dry glimmer. "It depends upon who is listening. Has any hand tampered with the lion's mouth since last night?" "No, sir. I kept Constable Jenkins upon it like a bulldog, as you said. No one nearer than 10 paces. Good. We shall be there for half an hour." Holmes moved at once to the center of the bridge, with that long, lazy stride which is only laziness to the unobservant. He had brought with him the narrow-beam lantern, his lens, and a small parcel wrapped in oilskin. His first act was to crouch again beside the inner lip of the parapet. He did not open the lantern. Instead, he held his face so close to the stone that the damp must have kissed his cheek, and he passed the lens to and fro with the delicacy of a watchmaker. Presently he gave a soft exclamation and beckoned me to kneel. At first I could make out nothing. The marble, if it was truly marble, and not some clever cladding, offered only its pale, clammy blankness. But as my sight accustomed itself, there resolved upon the stone a minute crescent of darker stain, no larger than a fingernail, at the very cusp where the parapet's top met its inner face. "What do you see, Watson?" "A smear," I ventured. "Of damp or soot?" "Soot is black and honest," said he, in that lecturing undertone of his which never failed to amuse me. "This is not soot. It is grease, commingled with grit much finer than that which rides our London air. Put your nose to it no more than a breath." I obeyed, though not without reluctance. A faint odor met me, elusive and yet distinct, like a memory half remembered. Oil? I was scared. Not oil. Beeswax with a trace of lamp-black and tallow, a soft dressing, Watson, smeared upon stone to keep a cord from abrading at the critical angle. See the Polish roundabout? The stone will shine if kissed often enough. Our ghost is tender of his equipment. He thinks ahead. Then he prepared the spot. He rehearsed it, Holmes corrected, and his mouth took on that keen inward smile which meant a line had joined 2 stars upon his mental chart. "Now attend." Here he shifted a hand's breadth. "Are the scratches you remarked last evening. They run down the inner lip and curve toward the lion's drain. But you will observe, if you are patient, that along the first half-inch the stone is faintly ridged, microscopic, but there. Those ridges are not the track of iron. They are cloth or rough weave, rubbed hard. I confess my imagination labored to keep pace. Clothes bound about something that would otherwise chatter against the stone air and wrapped in sacking, for example, drawn repeatedly over a fixed point. Why wrap it? To silence. Why draw it? To test the swing. He has been playing with his curtain cords, Watson. He opened the lantern a hair's breadth and sent its narrow ray skimming the underside of the parapet, then the graven mane of the lion. The stone glistened as if it had sweated. Holmes's beam halted upon the beast's mouth, lingered, darted away, and returned, like a ferret nosing a hole. He murmured, and from his pocket produced a tiny, thin bone spatula, such as a surgeon might use for lifting a delicate membrane. With it he reached beneath the upper lip of the lion's aperture and levered with exquisite care. There was a barely audible tick, a sound more felt than heard, and Holmes withdrew his hand, which held upon the spatula's edge a crumb so small I should have brushed it away for dirt. He cupped it instantly in his palm, shut the lantern, and, with a sideways glance to assure himself we were unremarked, slipped the crumb into the oilskin packet. "What is it?" I whispered. "Dust," said Holmes, as blandly as if he had described a cathedral. "We have enough." We left Sergeant Milliton with a word of thanks, and turned our steps southward into Southwark, that region of busy yards and mean courts, where the river's breath is forever in the air, and the trade of London hums like a great hidden engine. Holmes walked now with a sprightliness that belied his earlier languor. He hailed a cab, named a street I did not recognize, and sat with his head bowed and his eyes half shut, as if communing with some inner map. "You will observe, Watson," he said at last, without looking up, "that the yard's case such as it is turns upon the notion that Mr. Bixby, inflamed by jealousy, sees Miss Clara lose and either cast her into the river or contrived her fall. But we have learned two facts today. First, our ghost's apparatus was laid on the first night, when the watchman found the glove upon the parapet. Second, Miss Lewes died upon the third. The glove and the death belong to the same narrative, but do they belong to the same hand? I have learned, by long practice, not to be a slave to pairs. I do not follow you entirely, I admitted. He opened one eye, amused. You will, my dear fellow, you always do once the scenery is changed. The cab set us down in a narrow street lined with small shops, each with its particular perfume. Glue and sawdust from a carpenter's vinegar, from a pickle works, and from one, most marked of all, the sweet powdery breath of a milliner's. A modest sign read Miss O'Reilly, Modes at Chaipak. Within, the cases and stands were as neat as a drawing room, and sprays of imitation cherry blossom nodded above a row of bonnets. A stout, kindly woman with an Irish mouth and a French sign came forward, dusting her hands upon her apron. "Ladies' hats is our trade, gentlemen," she said, with a good-humored defiance. "But we've a dark room today, and little heart for trimming. You're come about poor Miss Lewes." Holmes's voice softened. "We are, madam. We have the inspector's permission to inquire." "You were her employer?" "For 3 years," said she, with a little lift of the head that was pride and pain in equal part. Best needle on the borough side. Quiet, mind you, and kept to herself. But there was sunshine in her when she forgot to be careful. "Careful?" Holmes repeated. Miss O'Reilly hesitated. She had a way of listening behind her eyes, Mr. Holmes. A way of listening, I say, when a gentleman spoke kindly to her as if she were weighing his words and the place they'd fit. Not flighty, not foolish. I'm not one to pry. Girls have their secrets. But she'd been pestered these last weeks by a fine gentleman with a soft tongue, and it was that, I'll lay my scissors, that brought the trouble. "Name?" Holmes asked, as if requesting ribbon by the yard. "No more than Mr. Ashore, something like that. A month ago he ordered a hat for a lady fine taste, but fidgety about the tremand after that he'd be passing an evening, asking would Miss Lewes step out a moment, like. Could she describe him? Tallish, well set up. Hands like a gentleman's, but a workman's eye on everything. Smelt of some posh scent lavender. I'd swear, though I'd not know one flower from another, if you pinned it to me." Holmes and I exchanged a swift glance. "Did he give an address?" Holmes continued. "Left a card one time," she said, rummaging among a sheaf of billheads. "But Miss Clara took it. She kept her things tidy. There's her little box under the counter still. I didn't have the heart to open it." Holmes's fingers, so deft with stone and dust, were no less gentle with sorrow. He drew out the small work box, a plain object of stained pine, with a brass hasband laid it upon the counter. Miss O'Reilly turned the key. Within lay the modest possessions of a working woman: a tape, a thimble, a tiny scent bottle, several folded notes, and carefully wrapped in tissue, a single white glove. I felt my breath catch. Holmes's hand hovered above it like a hawk's wing and then settled. He did not lift it at once. Instead, he located the notes and spread them, face down, upon the counter. "Receipts," said he, glancing. "Boots repaired last Tuesday. A chemist's powder and salt volatile. A pawnbroker, a ring redeemed a fortnight ago. And here Chandler and Amp's son, marble masons, Lambeth Road 2 visits. Useful." He replaced the papers with the exactitude of a clerk. "May I?" I asked, and at Miss O'Reilly's nod, I lifted the glove. It was of kid skin, white once and now faintly ivory with use, wedge-fingered in the manner of the day. A small maker's mark Devereux, Rue Saint-Honoré, was stamped within the wrist. There was a spot upon the cuff chalk, and the faintest perfume, which could have been the ghost of the tiny scent bottle beside it. Holmes watched me with that fond, ironic patience he sometimes bestowed when I played student. "Well, doctor?" "A lady's glove, Parisian. C6, perhaps 6 1/4. Left hand, .6 1/4. Holmes corrected, and his eyes shone. "You begin to hear the tune. Miss O'Reilly, did she wear these often?" "Her best pair," said the good woman, blinking. "She put them up safely when it rained." Holmes wrapped the glove again with a care that was almost reverent, replaced it, and closed the box. "Thank you. We will trouble you no further for the present. If a gentleman calling himself Mr. Ashe returns, you will be so kind as to send for the police and for me. Here is my card." He offered one of his plain business slips, and we took our leave. The drizzle had thickened the light, curiously, seemed to grow thinner even as the hour advanced. We walked in silence for some minutes. Holmes guiding us through 2 turns into a narrower court, where a single lamp made a small golden island upon the wet cobbles. There he paused under an archway and looked up at the eaves, where water gathered and fell with an exactness that would have charmed a metronome. "Watson," he said at last, in that tone which told me he spoke chiefly to himself, "the difference between 6 and 6 in water is the difference between a pear and a plant." I stared. "You mean—" But in an instant the shutters were down. He became vague, almost foolishly so, as if he had not heard me. "What a deplorable climate we endure. Your Afghan constitution bears it better than mine. Shall we try the Lambeth direction before the light entirely fails? There is a mason whose dust has ambitions beyond tombstones." I am not ashamed to say I bridled. "Holmes, you drag me hither and yon as if I were your portmanteau. If you have an inference, in heaven's name give it words. Do you hint that the glove the watchman found was not the fellow to the glove upon Miss Luz's hand?" He finished, with a smile that was maddening in its playfulness. "Tut, tut, what a leap, Watson. You will twist your ankle. I said nothing so crude. I merely remark upon sizes. A soldier notes calibers a physician, pulses a detective, measures. Come. There are moments when friendship is tested not by danger but by silence." I swallowed my protest and followed him. We found Chandler and Amp, son, in a yard behind the Lambeth Road, a cavernous place of hoists and trestles, where slabs of marble and limestone stood against the damp walls like ranks of pale sentries. A gritty dust hung upon the air and lay upon the floor in a perpetual drift. A thin man with a hooked nose, his apron gray to the elbows, approached with the wary politeness of the trade. "Looking for headstones, gentlemen? There's a delay on the finer Carrara." "Not headstones," Holmes returned. "Lions. You supplied cladding and ornaments to the marble bridge?" "We did," said the man, with a modicum of pride, "under Mr. Wendell's direction. An artist, he called himself. He had a French way with him, and it smelled like a perfume shop." "Lavender," I murmured. The man's lip twitched. "If you like. He was particular about the mouth, said the water must sing when it came through. Had us smooth the inner lip with wax and cloth, so as the flow should be even. I told him the stone wants a bite to hold a fall. He said art wants polish. We did as we were paid." "Wax and cloth," Holmes repeated, as blandly as a person at grace. "And the cloth? Hessian old sacking. We rub with it when we dress the marble. Leaves line like a plowed field when you look close." "Why?" "For no reason at all," Holmes said, smiling. "Only that the water does sing, under your lions, and I wondered at the method. Did Mr. Wendell call often? Often?" "He lived near here," said the mason with a sniff. "Knew his stone, I'll give him that. I knew women, too, by the look. There was a young lady who came twice with him, modest, neat. He had her try a hand along the smooth bit. Said he liked to see a lady leave a touch on his work." She laughed. "It puts me out, somehow. And I'm not a squeamish man. Could you give us Mr. Wendell's present address? Addresses are not my business. He had a room over Mrs. Venn's in Cobbler's Row, last I knew. If he's gone, she'll have the trail." Holmes thanked him, accepted a small scrap of pumice the fellow pressed upon him as if it were a favor, and led me out. When we had gone a dozen yards, he stopped beneath another lamp and opened, with covert care, the oilskin packet he had slipped into his pocket upon the bridge. Within lay that same minute crumb he had levered from the lion's mouth, no bigger than the head of a pin. He touched it with his little spatula. It broke with a mealy fracture, and left a faint gray smudge like ash. "Wax," I said. Wax laced with pumice and lampblack a polisher's recipe, and within see, when the lantern is opened to a hair these sparkles. "Marble's own dust calcite, Watson. Our ghost keeps his stage bright. But there is a third note here, so faint you will not hear it yet. No matter. You will not tell me not yet," he said, almost gently. "Forgive me. There is a time to utter and a time to gather. If I show my hand too soon, the author will revise his play. Let him keep to his lines a little longer." We found Cobbler's Row without difficulty, though it was one of those cramped, dejected byways whose name is more cheerful than its appearance. Mrs. Venn proved to be a wiry widow with a tongue like a bodkin and a heart, I judged, not far behind it. "Mr. Wendell?" she repeated, at Holmes's inquiry. "A pleasant-spoken gentleman, and very punctual with his rent. He's taken himself off these 10 days. Said he had a commission in Hammersmith. Left a trunk, and said he'd send for it. I don't hold with trunks left. Mr. Holmes folk, as leave trunks too often leave debts. May we see the room?" Holmes asked with his most disarming smile. She sniffed, hesitated, and with a muttered injunction against policemen in their boots, led us up a tight stair to a little chamber whose window gave upon a rain-dark wall. It was neat, bare, and betrayed nothing but a vigorous attention to dusting. Holmes's gaze went at once to the mantel, where, amidst 2 cheap prints, there stood a shallow dish with a gray residue clinging to its lip. He passed a finger across it, sniffed, and made a small sound in his throat. Then to the washstand, where a sliver of soap lay scented, if my nose did not betray me, with a ghost of lavender. He did not pocket either, he merely looked. There was, too, upon the sill, a thread so pale as to be nearly invisible snagged upon a splinter of the sash. Holmes lifted it with his forceps and laid it upon his cuff, where it lay like moonlight. It was of some fine fiber, not cotton and not silk. It had a soft furred quality that suggested a trimming rather than a garment. "Down," said he, satisfied. "We have the color of the curtain. We shall soon have the name of the theater." As we took our leave, Mrs. Venn thrust a card upon us, crumpled by long pocketing. "He left this by accident, I think," she said. "Found it this morning under the bed. Had lavender on it." Holmes took it, glanced, and his lids drooped a fraction. It read, A. Wendell Decorative Works and Ornaments Appointments by letter Marble Bridge Committee Rooms, Queen Street, when we were again in the street. The drizzle having grown into a sober rain, I could no longer contain myself. "Holmes," I said, "you are playing both sides of a conversation and leaving me to applaud in ignorance. You have gathered wax from a lion's mouth, dust from a mantel shelf, and a thread from a window. You have sniffed lavender until I cannot smell my own tobacco. Tell me, what have you?" He looked at me, and for once there was no play in him, only that grave kindness which, on rare occasions, shone through all the artifice. "I have, my dear Watson," said he, "what I always most desire, a contradiction. When a story tells me that a lady's glove was found on a Tuesday, and it's made on a Thursday, and that they belong to the same hand, I compare the hands. When a bridge tells me it is solid, and a man walks through it, I compare the stone. When a scent tells me it is worn to charm, and it lingers upon fear, I compare the wearer. And the contradiction?" He smiled, and the shutters came down once more. "You will forgive me if I borrow your patience until tomorrow. Tonight we will pay a visit to the committee rooms after hours. Bring your stoutest stick, but use it not. If our author keeps to his rehearsals, there will be a second incident before the week is spent, and I would be at the audience's edge when the curtain stirs." We walked homeward under the steady rain, the lamps blurring into aureoles about their posts, the river lifting its slow, black shoulder against the piers. London's great body breathed its damp breath, and somewhere within that monstrous chest our ghost no spectre, but a man prepared his next scene. In our rooms later, as the fire made its quiet converse with the grate, and Holmes's lean figure grew out of the chair back like a shade, he held the oilskin packet to the glow for an instant, then tucked it away among his papers. He and I spoke of Trifle Scutari, a new poet in the magazines, Mrs. Hudson's grievance with the Coleman butt. In my mind there hovered always the glove in the box at Miss O'Reilly's, a little thing, perfect, feminine, and, if I read my friend aright, not the sister to its fellow upon the river's dead. I slept ill and dreamed of lions whose mouths murmured with bees. Chapter C. A second incident, when Sherlock Holmes remarks that a play once begun must be played to its end. He speaks not figuratively, but with the cold exactitude of one accustomed to the rhythms of human calculation. The morning after our expedition to Lambeth, I found him in his dressing gown at the window of Baker Street, gazing out at the weak October sun with that air of patient predation which I had learned to recognize as the sure herald of events. The Times lay unopened beside the teapot, his pipe, unlit, hung idly between long fingers. "Watson," he said, without turning, "the author of our little ghost story is not content with 3 acts. He will attempt a 4th and soon." "On what grounds do you say so?" I asked, pouring the tea. "Because his design is not complete. He has not yet drawn the curtain upon his true objective. Last night his stage remained as he prepared it. The wax, the cord, the lion's mouth, they have not been disturbed. Therefore he has not finished." I confess I shivered slightly, remembering the pale figure that had coalesced from the mist. "Then we should return to the bridge at once." "Not yet," he replied. "If he means to act, he will not do so in the bright noon. Darkness is his ally. Meanwhile, we must learn who else treads this stage besides the players we already know." He rang for Mrs. Hudson, and after a brief exchange, dispatched a note by boy to Lestrade, requesting that the bridge remain under discreet observation, but that no arrests or newspaper leaks be made without Holmes's express approval. "The inspector," Holmes remarked, "has the dangerous habit of blowing a whistle before the quarry is in the net." A quiet afternoon, a violent evening, the hours passed uneventfully, though Holmes spent them not in idleness. He examined under the lens the thread taken from Wendell's window, muttering occasionally about nap direction and foreign trimming. He also warmed the wax crumb over the lamp flame until it released a faint scent, not lavender, as I expected, but something like resin and linseed, which he sniffed with keen delight. By 6 o'clock he had exchanged his dressing gown for his Inverness cape, pocketed several items from his chemical table, and declared himself ready. "There will be a disturbance tonight, Watson," he said. If we are fortunate, we shall watch it unfold from behind the curtains, not upon the stage. The fog that evening was of that dense, low-lying character which clings to the river like damp wool. Lamps burned as pale, uncertain globes, and the roar of the Thames was muted, as though heard through thick drapery. At the north end of Marble Bridge, Sergeant Milliton met us, his mustache beaded with moisture. "Nothing yet, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "but there's been folk walking to and fro more than usual reporters, mostly." "Keep them well back," Holmes said curtly. "Let no curious eye spoil our vantage." He led me, as before, to the shadow of the lion's parapet, just beyond the midpoint. There we crouched, our outlines indistinguishable from the fog-wet stone. The sergeant and his men withdrew to the approaches, their figures melting into the mist. Time slowed, as it always did in such vigils, until every small sound became portentous. The drip from the parapet, the creak of distant timbers, the faint chime of St. Paul's carried by the damp air. Then it came the footstep, soft at first, measured, echoing from no visible source. Tap, tap, tap along the empty walkway. My heart thumped with involuntary excitement, for the sound carried the same uncanny quality as before, as though issuing from the bones of the bridge itself. Holmes's hand touched my arm lightly. There, through the fog, the pale figure emerged, once more a man-shaped apparition in a light cloak and broad-brimmed hat, moving with smooth, deliberate grace toward the center. This time, however, the stage direction changed. From the southern end, another figure very real appeared, hurrying toward the ghost. "A policeman." "Fool," Holmes muttered. The constable, unaware of the trap he was about to spring, called out. The ghostly figure did not flee. Instead, it halted, turned, and seemed to gesture faintly toward the lion's mouth. The constable broke into a run, and at that moment, from somewhere beneath the parapet, there came a metallic snap, sharp and clean, like a rope giving way under strain. The ghost dissolved into the mist like a trick of the lantern. The constable reached the midpoint, then vanished. It happened in less than a heartbeat. One moment he was upon the walkway, lantern raised the next. The air itself seemed to swallow him whole. A splash echoed faintly from below. "Quickly, Watson." Holmes was already at the parapet, flashing his lantern into the lion's throat. I rushed to his side and glimpsed, for a moment, a dark shape swinging beneath the bridge, caught upon some contrivance, a man dangling, not falling, suspended by a rope hand pulley hidden within the lion's carved jaws. The mechanism shuddered, then released with a final jerk, plunging the unfortunate constable into the river below. Shouts rose from both ends of the bridge. Milliton's men came running, their boots thundering upon the stones. Holmes seized the cord, where it had whipped free from the lion's mouth, and drew it out a length of wax line attached to a weighted iron ring, cleverly fitted to slide within the drainage channel. The ghost had struck again, not with murder this time, but with demonstration. Within minutes, boats were launched from the embankment. By good fortune, the constable was pulled from the Thames alive, coughing and sputtering but uninjured. The mechanism, however, had done its work. The panic spread like wildfire. Word of the ghost's attack flew through the reporters, who had lingered near, and by the time we returned to the bridge's midpoint, a crowd had gathered at both ends, murmuring fearfully into the fog. Holmes's quiet fury, Holmes, stood by the lion's mouth, the cord coiled at his feet, his expression taut and dangerous. "Watson," he said softly, "this is no longer theater. Tonight he tested a snare, one designed to seize, hold, and release at his leisure. Yesterday a glove, tonight a constable. Tomorrow who?" "Holmes," I said, breathless. "Could Wendell have constructed this?" "He or someone equally meticulous. The device relies upon the bridge's own structure, the drainage channel, the parapet, the lion's cavity. It is the work of a man who knows both stone and physics and has rehearsed upon this stage unseen." Lestrade arrived soon after, splashing through the fog like an indignant heron. "Another attack," he cried. "Holmes, this is intolerable. We'll close the bridge, flood it with men." Holmes rounded on him with uncharacteristic sharpness. "And drive the culprit back into shadow before he shows his hand. No, Lestrade, let him think his ghost has cowed you. Do nothing publicly. Privately, double the watch beneath the bridge. Tonight, the mechanism was sprung from below, not above." Lestrade bristled. "And if someone dies tomorrow?" "Then," Holmes said icily, "it will be because you acted like a blunderbuss instead of a scalpel. Do as I say." There was such authority in his voice that even Lestrade, unused to obedience, hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. Aftermath, we returned to Baker Street in silence. The city, though muffled by fog, seemed alive with rumor. I saw newspaper boys already hawking early editions with lurid headlines: "The Ghost Strikes Again, Policeman Thrown into the Thames." In our rooms, Holmes cast the recovered cord onto the table and examined it minutely under his lens. "Same wax dressing," he muttered. "Same polish. But the pulley ring is new. Our ghost improvised." He looked up at me suddenly. "Watson, We are close now, so close, I can almost hear the man breathing behind the mask. The hidden clue is in place. One more night, and the lion shall tell us his secret. Chapter the 7th. Misdirection deepens. It was upon the morning after the constable's narrow escape that London awoke in a fever of half-belief, half-panic. The ghost of the Marble Bridge, once the amusement of evening papers, had become the city's dark obsession. Shopboys whispered it in breadlines, hansom drivers swapped conflicting accounts through fog. The broadsheets carried headlines that struck the eye like hammer blows. The ghost strikes again, constable thrown into the Thames police, baffled Marble Bridge to be closed. At Baker Street, the pile of telegrams that morning was astonishing. Solicitors, society hostesses, reporters, even a spiritualist society begged Holmes for statements or explanations. He answered none of them. He sat at the table in his shirt sleeves, pipe unlit, studying with a magnifier the iron ring and cord retrieved from the lion's mouth the previous night. He moved as though his mind were elsewhere, deep in some private corridor of deduction. Lestrade arrived shortly after breakfast, looking tired and, for once, without bluster. "The papers have made a circus of it, Holmes," he said grimly. "Half London's threatening to boycott the bridge, and the other half's demanding we post a regiment on it." The commissioner had 3 MPs in his office before 9 o'clock. Holmes did not look up. "Then London, for once, is divided upon a matter that merits division. You are being watched, Lestrade." "I beg your pardon?" Holmes raised his eyes slowly. "The ghost has twice performed without hindrance. He relies upon the police behaving as a blunt instrument. Close the bridge or swarm it with constables, and he retreats. Do nothing, and he repeats. But if the police adopt a posture of apparent confusion, then our playwright grows careless. You've a fine taste for melodrama," Lestrade muttered. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not melodrama, Inspector. Misdirection. It is the lifeblood of this affair." The sudden appearance of Wendell that same afternoon, just as the rain began again in earnest. A telegram arrived from Sergeant Milliton. Wendell returned Cobbler's Row midday. Left at once for Bridge Committee rooms. Seemed agitated. Advised you as requested. Holmes's eyes sharpened like a blade. "Our sculptor returns to his theater, Watson. Let us pay him a visit before the final rehearsal." The Marble Bridge Committee rooms, situated on Queen Street, were housed in a neat Georgian building whose white facade was streaked by years of rain and smoke. Inside, we were met by a clerk who, after much hesitation, directed us to a small committee chamber upstairs. The door was ajar. Within, by the light of a coal fire, stood a man whose appearance matched precisely the shadow Wendell had cast in the accounts of others. Tall, spare, well-dressed, with an oddly theatrical sweep to his movements. His iron-gray hair was brushed carefully back, and a faint scent of lavender hung in the air. He turned as we entered, eyes narrowing. "Gentlemen, you intrude upon private business." "On the contrary," Holmes said smoothly, stepping forward. "We intrude upon public mischief. Mr. Albert Wendell, I presume?" The man inclined his head with mock politeness. "And you are the famous Mr. Holmes. Your reputation precedes you, though I confess I have never had cause to trouble myself with ghosts." Holmes ignored the barb. "You were seen returning to your lodgings this morning, after an absence of 10 days, an absence which coincided, curiously, with the haunting of the Marble Bridge." Wendell's smile did not reach his eyes. "A coincidence, nothing more. I was in Hammersmith, engaged upon a decorative commission for St. Agnes Chapel." "Indeed. And yet," Holmes said, drawing from his pocket the scrap of pumice and wax, "your signature remains upon the lions of the bridge. It is difficult to mistake the hand that polished those throats smoothly." "Is it a crime," Wendell said lightly, "to make one stone sing in the rain?" "No," Holmes replied, "but it is unusual for a mason to scent his work with lavender." For a fleeting instant, Wendell's mask slipped just enough for me to see a flicker of unease. "I have nothing more to say," he snapped. "I am a tradesman, not a criminal, and if you have questions about ghosts, perhaps you should ask the police, who seem most adept at producing them." With a curt bow, he brushed past us and descended the stairs. Holmes watched him go with narrowed eyes. "He is a man who performs for others," he murmured. "Did you note the hands, Watson?" "They were steady," I said. "Narrow, clever fingers. Clever enough to build our mechanism," Holmes said. "But I practiced too much." He was ready for us, which means he expected us, curious. Holmes's uncharacteristic behavior from that hour. Holmes grew, there is no other word for it, unpredictable. In previous cases, I had watched his mind work with the linear elegance of a well-oiled machine, but now he became almost erratic, disappearing for hours without explanation, returning with muddy boots and a distant stare, sending telegrams to obscure addresses, taking down books on acoustics and fluid mechanics, even, to my surprise, requesting a small bundle of theatrical props from a supplier in Drury Lane. "Holmes," I said one evening, unable to contain myself, "you are behaving in a manner I cannot reconcile with your usual method. Have you lost the thread?" He gave me a quick, mischievous smile. On the contrary, my dear Watson, I am weaving two threads together. But if I show you the pattern before the knot is tied, you will only spoil the surprise. Is Wendell our man? I prated. He is a man, Holmes said carefully. Whether he is the man remains to be seen. There is another figure upon this stage one we have not yet glimpsed. A mysterious figure the following night. Holmes insisted that we return to the bridge, though there had been no new incidents since the constable's fall. He will not strike twice in quick succession, Holmes said, but he may observe. And the observer, Watson, is often more vulnerable than the actor. We took up our station near the Lion's Mouth shortly after midnight. The fog had thinned to a faint veil, and the river gleamed darkly below. For an hour, nothing stirred but the occasional passerby. Then, from the shadows of the southern embankment, a tall figure detached itself and began walking slowly toward the bridge knot Wendell, whose gait I now knew well, but someone broader in the shoulder, wrapped in a dark greatcoat. The figure paused at the southern approach, as if listening. Holmes's hand touched my sleeve. "Do not move," he whispered. The figure advanced to the midpoint, then leaned over the parapet knot where the glove had been placed before, but on the western side, opposite the lion. He remained there for perhaps a minute, as though examining something hidden beneath the stonework, then withdrew, retracing his steps swiftly into the fog. Holmes exhaled softly. "There," he murmured. "The unseen hand at last. Wendell is the craftsman, but someone else is directing the play." The deepening web the next morning. Lestrade brought news that confounded the police's tidy narrative. Wendell, despite his suspicious manner, had spent the night under observation by 2 constables, and had not approached the bridge. "He's slippery," Lestrade grumbled, "but he didn't set foot near that spad." Holmes seemed almost pleased. "Excellent. Let him remain free. He is the misdirection the magicians flourish. The real culprit hides behind him." "Behind him?" I repeated. "In plain sight," Holmes said, his eyes glittering. "But patience, Watson. Tonight I set my trap, and when the curtain falls, we shall see who stands upon the stage and who pulls the strings behind it." He turned to the window, where the fog once more gathered like a conspirator. I knew that look well. The hunt was truly on. Chapter the 8th. Holmes' plan. I had seen Sherlock Holmes at work in many guises. As the cold logician pacing before the fire, as the hawk-eyed investigator scouring the streets of London, and on rarer occasions, as the consummate actor, slipping into disguises so convincing that even I, his longtime companion, could scarcely penetrate them. But never had I seen him combine all 3 aspects with such quiet intensity as he did on that damp October afternoon when the ghost of the Marble Bridge had the whole city by the throat. "Watson," he said abruptly, pushing aside his breakfast plate untouched, "by tonight we shall close the curtain on this performance. Our phantom has written his last act. It is for us to provide the stage direction." He rose and went to the cabinet where he kept a variety of costumes and theatrical odds and ends collected over years of investigation. From it he produced a rough laborer's jacket, a soft felt cap, and a pair of boots with thick rubbered soles. Then, to my astonishment, he took a small pot of grease paint from a drawer, together with a false beard of streaked gray. "You intend to disguise yourself?" I asked. "Intend?" he repeated, with a rare flash of humor. "My dear fellow, I have already begun. By midnight, not even Mrs. Hudson would recognize me." He paused, studying me over the rim of his spectacles. "And you, Watson, will remain precisely as you are, a respectable medical man, sufficiently inconspicuous to watch without drawing attention, but conspicuous enough to be believed if the time comes." Laying the snare throughout the day, Holmes worked with meticulous deliberation. He sent a messenger with sealed envelopes to Lestrade and Sergeant Milliton, containing instructions that were not shared even with me. He then examined once more the cord and pulley retrieved from the Lion's Mouth, taking measurements with his tape and muttering figures under his breath. At intervals he consulted the bridge blueprints, tracing certain drainage tunnels with his pencil, then sitting back to smoke in deep thought. By late afternoon, his preparations took on a curious theatrical flavor. He selected a coil of stout rope, a pair of climbing irons, and most curious of all, a small hand mirror mounted on a telescopic rod, which he concealed beneath his jacket. "You are going beneath the bridge," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "There is a narrow platform within the southern drainage chamber originally meant for maintenance. Our phantom has used it to manipulate his ghost. Tonight, I shall occupy that post before he does." "Alone? Not alone, Watson," he said, giving me a look both sharp and kind. "You will be upon the bridge, exactly at the midpoint, pretending to observe casually. If all goes well, you will see nothing but fog. If it does not, shout for Milliton's men. And the phantom," his lips thinned, "the phantom will find that his trap has become my theater." Holmes in disguise at dusk. Holmes emerged from his room transformed. Gone was the fastidious consulting detective. In his place stood a grizzled navvy, shoulders stooped, beard uneven, cap pulled low. His boots were muddy and worn, his jacket frayed at the cuffs. But it was the eyes that struck me most. Holmes had a peculiar ability to alter not merely his face, but his entire bearing. Gone was the piercing, analytical gaze. In its place was the dull, habitual glance of a man accustomed to physical labor. "Convincing?" he asked. "Utterly," I replied. He grinned briefly. "Then let us be about it. By midnight, our author will play his hand." Beneath the marble bridge, we reached the southern embankment just after 11, moving like two conspirators in the thick fog. Holmes led me to a locked iron grating, one of the inspection hatches beneath the bridge. Producing a small key of his own making, he silently turned the bolt and opened it. A flight of slick, narrow steps led down into the blackness below. "This is where we part ways," he whispered. "In half an hour, take your station at the lion's mouth. Appear curious, but not vigilant. If all proceeds correctly, the ghost will not see you, he will see only his stage." I clasped his hand. "Take care, Holmes." He gave me that rare, warm smile that surfaced in our most dangerous moments. "I always do, Watson. But tonight, it is he who should beware." And with that, he disappeared into the darkness beneath the bridge. The waiting there are few ordeals more trying than waiting upon a foggy bridge at midnight, while knowing that some cunning hand moves beneath one's feet. The city had fallen into that peculiar hush which precedes the small hours. Distant wheels muffled, lamps burning in lonely pairs, the Thames rolling darkly beneath like a living thing. I stationed myself, as instructed, at the midpoint near the Lion, feigning idle interest in the river. My heart beat with a strange mixture of excitement and unease. Somewhere below, Holmes crouched in the damp darkness, watching and waiting. 12:30 struck from a distant bell. Then came what I had been dreading and anticipating. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, measured. From the southern end they came, exactly as before. Out of the fog emerged the pale figure once again, cloaked and broad-brimmed, gliding toward the center. But something was different. There was a precision to its movement I had not noticed before, less ghostly, more purposeful, as though each step was aligned with invisible markers. I stiffened, scanning the edges of the fog. Then I saw him, a second figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark greatcoat and hat, walking in perfect step behind the ghost, but at a slight distance like a man observing his own trick. This was the same silhouette Holmes and I had glimpsed nights earlier, leaning over the parapet. The two figures advanced, one pale, one dark, actor and playwright. Holmes springs the trap suddenly. From beneath the lion's mouth, there came a low mechanical click, then a different sound, sharp and metallic. At that precise moment, the ghostly figure halted at the parapet and raised one arm in its familiar gesture. The dark figure behind him leaned forward as though to give some signal. And then the bridge itself answered. From the lion's throat shot a beam of lantern light, angled upward by Holmes's hidden mirror. It struck the ghostly figure full upon the chest, revealing not a spirit at all, but a man clad in a pale waterproof cloak, the inside of which had been painted with reflective chalk. Beneath the hat, a white gauze mask half covered his face. The sudden brilliance froze him like an actor caught before his cue. "Now, Watson!" Holmes's voice rang out from beneath. I shouted as instructed. At once, Milliton's men, hidden at both ends of the bridge, rushed forward. The dark figure spun and attempted to flee southward, but Holmes was already ahead of him. He burst from the hatch like some subterranean demon, seized the man by the legs, and hauled him down into the maintenance chamber below. The pale ghost tried to bolt north, but Lestrade and two constables intercepted him before he had gone 10 paces. The bridge was alive with shouts, lanterns, and the clatter of boots. The fog churned like stage smoke under the sudden commotion. The unmasking by the time I reached the southern chamber. Lantern in hand, Holmes stood over the dark figure, who lay winded but not unconscious upon the damp stones. His hat had fallen, revealing a smooth, florid face with close-cropped hair and the unmistakable bearing of a man of position, not Wendell, not a common criminal. Lestrade arrived moments later, dragging the pale-cloaked Manuel between two constables. The decorative mason's theatrical confidence was gone. He looked pale and trembling. Holmes regarded the dark man coolly. "So," he said, "the chairman of the Marble Bridge Committee takes the stage at last." I started. "Chairman?" Holmes nodded grimly. "Mr. Edward Markham, Member of Parliament for Southwark, the designer of this entire ghostly charade." Markham struggled to regain his composure. "You've no proof." Holmes held up the iron pulley ring. "No proof. Your mechanism is in my hands. Your ghost is in custody. And you yourself walk the stage tonight, Mr. Markham," not realizing the theater was already occupied. The trap complete by 2 in the morning, the ghost of the Marble Bridge was no more. Wendell, shaken and weeping, confessed to being the craftsman, bribed handsomely to create the ghostly effects, the cloak, and the pulley devices. Markham, powerful, arrogant, and desperate, had used Wendell's skills to stage hauntings in order to depress property values near the bridge, allowing him and his confederates to purchase riverside plots cheaply, before a planned expansion. Holmes had suspected as much for days, but tonight his trap had caught both actor and playwright in a single stroke. As dawn broke pale over the Thames, Lestrade stood upon the bridge, lantern in hand, shaking his head. "I'll never understand it, Holmes. A ghost selling land?" "Not a ghost, Lestrade," Holmes said, his eyes tired, but all right. "A story. And there is nothing London fears or buys more dearly than a good story." Chapter the 9th. The reveal: it was a gray and solemn morning in Queen Street, and the committee room of the Marble Bridge Trust had been hastily converted into something resembling a courtroom. The long mahogany table, once the site of polite municipal debate, now hosted Lestrade, a pair of grim constables, Wendell in handcuffs, and the man at the center of it all, Edward Markham, MP, his ruddy face pale beneath its usual veneer of command. Holmes sat at the head of the table, composed and almost austere, as if he presided over a lecture at St. Bartholomew's, rather than the unmasking of one of the boldest frauds London had seen in years. I took my customary place with his right hand. The fog still clung faintly to the windows, diffusing the thin light into a ghostly pallor. A small crowd of committee clerks and curious officials had gathered at the doorway, whispering among themselves. It was not every day that a member of Parliament was brought low before dawn. Lestrade, for once, had the good sense to let Holmes lead. The inspector's usual brusqueness was tempered by the events of the night. Indeed, I detected something almost like respect in the way he waited for Holmes to speak. Holmes steepled his long fingers. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and steady, "I am aware that this affair has gathered about it a fog of superstition, rumor, and political embarrassment. Before the day is out, the papers will invent half a dozen motives and 100 false details. It is therefore best that I place before you the entire sequence of events, in their proper order and without embellishment." He leaned forward slightly. "This is not a story of ghosts. It is a story of greed, cunning, and theatric. The first act, the stage is set when the Marble Bridge was completed earlier this year." Holmes began. "Mr. Markham, as chairman of the committee, possessed privileged knowledge of planned riverside developments that would multiply property values along the southern embankment. However, several riverside warehouses and workshops, including lands abutting the bridge, were privately held and not yet for sale. Markham's associates could not purchase the land at fair market price." He turned his gaze upon Markham, whose jaw tightened, but who said nothing. "Enter Albert Wendell, decorative mason and sometime theatrical carpenter." Wendell's talents were not merely in stone, but in stage illusion. Together, they devised a scheme to depress property values through fear. A bridge, rumored to be haunted, a place where strange apparitions were seen and mysterious deaths occurred, would discourage buyers, drive out current owners, and allow certain parties to acquire riverside lots for a pittance. A simple stratagem, but devilishly effective in a city as credulous as London. Markham shifted in his chair. "You have no proof of these accusations," he muttered. Holmes's gaze was like cold steel. "On the contrary, I have proof of every step. Wendell's testimony will corroborate it. But let us proceed with logic alone. The second act, the ghost appears. Wendell was commissioned to prepare the mechanism. He used his privileged access as a decorative contractor to smooth the lions' throats with wax and pumice, fit pulley rings within the drainage channels, and devise a means of lowering a cloaked accomplice into position unseen. The first night, the ghost in reality, Wendell himself appeared upon the bridge in a pale reflective cloak, using the fog and lantern reflections to give the impression of a figure half real, half mist. He left behind a single white glove, placed deliberately upon the parapet to mark the stage and seed public imagination. This was the glove found by the night watchman Briggs. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced the glove in question, now sealed in a small evidence envelope. "This glove is size 6, Parisian made. The glove upon Miss Clara Lews's hand was 6 1/4, not a pair. One belonged to Wendell's ghostly stage property, the other to the victim." This revelation caused a murmur in the room. I saw Wendell flinch. "The third act, the victim, Miss Clara Lewes," Holmes continued, "a milliner of Southwark, had caught Wendell's attention some weeks earlier. She visited his mason's yard twice, in connection with a commission for a decorative hat stand, an entirely innocent affair. But Wendell, ever theatrical, brought her to the bridge during its finishing stages, ostensibly to show her the lions. I spoke to a mason who remembered this vividly." Wendell dropped his eyes. "She became acquainted, in turn, with Mr. Markham," Holmes said, turning his gaze upon the MP, a young, attractive working woman, alone in London, an easy target for a man of means who believed himself untouchable. Whether he sought to seduce her, blackmail her, or merely amuse himself, I cannot say with certainty. What is certain is that she became a liability. She saw too much of his comings and goings at the bridge during the preparations." Markham began to speak, but Holmes's voice cut across him like a whip. "Do not trouble to deny it, sir. The pawnbroker receipt for the ring she redeemed a fortnight before her death, the visits to Wendell's yard, and the reports of their meetings from multiple witnesses form a chain too firm for denial. The fourth act, the death on the third night. The ghost appeared once more, but this time Miss Lewes was present. She was either lured to the bridge under false pretenses or brought there by force. The bruising upon her upper arm, which Watson observed, suggests the latter. She was seized near the midpoint, where Wendell's mechanism had been prepared. The pulley cord, attached to the lion's throat, was used to lower or destabilize her position. She was cast into the river and killed instantly upon striking the water. Her death was designed to intensify public hysteria. Lestrade's jaw tightened, and we arrested poor Bixby instead. Holmes gave a slight shrug. Bixby was useful to them. A jealous lover, with a quarrel known to many at, made a perfect smokescreen. The glove, the ghost, the quarrel, all threads in a tapestry designed to mislead Scotland Yard. And you, Inspector, obliged them. Lestrade flushed but said nothing. The fifth act, the demonstration the following night. The constable's near drowning was no accident, Holmes said. It was a demonstration. The ghost appeared again, this time to prove the mechanism worked even under scrutiny. A hidden operator below triggered the pulley snap, and the constable was ensnared and dropped into the river, while Wendell's pale figure melted away in the fog. This boldness was deliberate. It was meant to paralyze the authorities with confusion. He allowed the weight of that statement to settle. The clerks and constables listened as though to a courtroom drama. The final act, the trap, Holmes's tone grew almost leisurely. By then, gentlemen, the plot was transparent to any mind accustomed to separating the theatrical from the material. Wendell was the craftsman. Markham was the director. Wendell provided the ghostly illusion. Markham provided the motive and protection. He leaned forward. It was therefore necessary to force both to act simultaneously. If we arrested Wendell prematurely, Markham would fade into the fog like his own ghost. If we pursued Markham directly, Wendell's illusions might continue, leaving us with no proof of collusion. The only solution was a trap. He described, briefly and with characteristic precision, his midnight infiltration beneath the bridge, the mirror and lantern, and the precise timing that caught Wendell on the parapet and Markham lurking behind him. Criminals, Holmes concluded, are much like playwrights. They cannot resist watching their own finales. The confrontation. Markham, who had maintained a veneer of contempt throughout, suddenly burst out. You have spun a fanciful tale, Holmes, but tales are not law. You have no document, no signature, no need. Holmes interrupted coolly. Wendell's confession is already taken. The hidden cord, the pulley rings, the wax, the thread, the blueprint alterations, the glove, each is a note in the score, Mr. Markham, and I have played them all. Wendell spoke hoarsely for the first time. He's telling the truth. I built what he paid for. I never meant the girl to die, God help me. I never meant that. Markham's face went ashen. For the first time, his composure cracked. He struggled to rise, but Lestrade and his men were already upon him. The clatter of iron handcuffs echoed like punctuation to Holmes's statement. Holmes's modesty when the room had cleared and the culprits were led away. Lestrade turned to Holmes. You've done it again, he said gruffly. I'll see to it this goes straight to the commissioner. They'll be talking about this case for years. Holmes shrugged, lighting his pipe at last. It is of no particular brilliance, Inspector. A ghost that leaves mechanical scratches is no ghost at all. A glove that does not match its fellow is not mystery, but measurement. Once you strip away the fog, both literal and figurative, the matter is simple. He glanced at me, his eyes twinkling faintly. Would you not say so, Watson? I smiled. As ever, Holmes, it seems simple once you explain it. Chapter X, Aftermath. The newspapers, as Holmes had predicted, wasted no time in transforming our night's work into legend. Before midday, every major London daily carried breathless headlines. The ghost of the Marble Bridge, unmasked MP, in chains, haunting hoax exposed by Sherlock Holmes' cunning plot to ruin riverside properties. Foiled illustrations, some laughably inaccurate, depicted spectral figures vanishing beneath the parapet, lantern beams striking pale cloaks, and, in one particularly theatrical sketch, Holmes himself standing atop the lion's head, like St. George over the dragon. Holmes regarded the paper with mild disdain over breakfast, as though examining an insect of curious shape. The press, he remarked, will always prefer apparition to architecture. They cannot resist the phantom. And yet, I said, without them, Markham's scheme might have prospered. The panic they spread was the very instrument of his fraud. True, Holmes replied, though they played their part unwittingly. Like the musicians in the pit who do not see the stage, one cannot blame them for striking the note that another composed. Public unmasking. The public reaction to Markham's arrest was unlike anything I had witnessed before. A member of Parliament, caught staging hauntings for personal profit, stirred both outrage and fascination. Crowds gathered on the Marble Bridge, no longer in fear, but in curiosity. Hawkers sold penny pamphlets recounting the true tale of the ghostly gentleman, while enterprising photographers charged passers-by for portraits taken beside the lion's mouth, now famous. The mechanism, the cord, and pulley hidden within the lion's throat was displayed for inspection by curious citizens under the watch of uniformed police. Men in bowler hats leaned in to squint at the scratches. Ladies pressed scented handkerchiefs to their faces and whispered excitedly about how clever it all was. The very spot that had inspired dread became, overnight, a kind of macabre attraction. Sergeant Milliton, who had proved steady throughout, greeted us at the bridge on the day following the arrests. "They're treating it like a fairground, Mr. Holmes," he said ruefully. "Every old lady in Southwark wants to see where the ghost stood." Holmes gave one of his rare, thin smiles. "Fear, Sergeant, is like fog. Once it lifts, it leaves behind the stones, and the stones, alas, are dull." Bixby freed James Bixby, the unfortunate foreman who had spent 2 nights in custody, was released that morning. His face bore the drawn expression of a man who had glimpsed the gallows from too near, but his gratitude toward Holmes was genuine and deep. "I don't rightly understand all of it," he said, wringing Holmes's hand outside the yard, "but I know you saved my neck, sir. If there's ever work to be done on a bridge of yours, I'll do it for free." Holmes inclined his head. "Let us hope, Mr. Bixby, that no bridge of mine will ever require ghosts to make it interesting." Clara Lewes, the case's only true tragedy, was not forgotten. Miss Clara Lewes was laid to rest in a quiet ceremony attended by a few fellow workers, Miss O'Reilly, and ourselves. Holmes stood slightly apart from the mourners, his hands folded behind his back, his face unreadable. When the last handful of earth struck the coffin lid, I saw him close his eyes briefly. On the carriage ride back, I said gently, "You blame yourself." He shook his head. "No, but I acknowledge that, in unraveling mechanisms, one sometimes fails to linger upon the human. She was not the target, Watson, she was merely in the way. Such lives are often lost in the gears of ambition." Holmes and the committee in the days that followed. Holmes was summoned reluctantly by several members of the Bridge Committee to explain precisely how such a fraud had flourished under their very noses. I accompanied him to one such gathering, held in the same room where Markham had been unmasked. The committee members, dignified men of varying degrees of embarrassment, offered their thanks in florid terms. Holmes received them with his usual cool detachment. "It is not gratitude that interests me," he said. "It is structured. You built a stage and handed the keys to a dramatist. The lion's mouth, the drainage channels, the fog, and your own credulity, these were the scenery. Markham merely stepped onto it." One portly gentleman coughed uncomfortably. "But surely, Mr. Holmes, the supernatural elements were entirely man-made, sir," Holmes interrupted, his voice flat. "Your ghost was wax, cord, chalk, fog, and fear. Nothing more." They thanked him profusely again. He bowed stiffly and left. A quiet evening at Baker Street a week after the arrests. The fog lifted at last, and London lay beneath a cold, clear sky. I found Holmes in his armchair, pipe between his teeth, violin resting upon his knee. The firelight threw long shadows across the room. He had refused several public honors, including an offer to address the Royal Society on the psychology of urban hauntings. "I have no interest," he said, in turning fraud into a lecture. I joined him by the fire. "I have often wondered, Holmes," I said, "whether criminals like Markham truly believe they can escape you, or whether they imagine themselves clever enough to write their own endings." He smiled faintly. "They do write their own endings, Watson. I merely read them aloud." Markham conceived his play with skill. He found his actor in Wendell, his audience in the newspapers, his chorus in the fearful public. But he forgot one thing, and that was? Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "That fog disperses." For a moment we sat in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Outside, a hansom rattled past. The cries of distant newsboys floated faintly up the street. London, restless as ever, had already begun to turn the ghost into legend, forgetting the greed and mechanism beneath. Holmes leaned back and half closed his eyes. "It is curious," he said softly, "how often fear requires only a stage and a story. Give men a bridge in the fog, a pale cloak, and a whisper, and they will build their own ghosts." Markham understood this. He weaponized it. "And you," I said, turned his weapon against him. He shrugged modestly. "I merely lit a lantern in the lion's throat." Chapter She. The lingering shadow. There are cases in my long association with Sherlock Holmes which end cleanly, like a surgeon's incision, and others which leave behind faint but unsettling aftertastes, as though something of the mystery clings to the air long after the culprit is in chains. The affair of the ghost of the Marble Bridge belonged to the latter class. The legal machinery began its slow, inevitable turn. Markham's arrest caused a sensation in Parliament. Debates were held behind closed doors. Newspapers speculated endlessly about his confederates. A handful of lesser investors melted quietly into exile. Wendell, for his part, turned the Crown's evidence in exchange for leniency, and his confession filled column after column in the evening papers. But in Baker Street, life returned outwardly, at least to its familiar rhythms. Holmes spent long hours at his chemical table, performing minute analyses, with an intensity that suggested a new problem occupied him, though he shared nothing of it with me. His violin returned to its corner, silent. He read no newspapers. There was, I fancied, a faint restlessness about him, as though some small burr of the case still lodged beneath his formidable intellect. Holmes's uneasy quiet one damp afternoon, a fortnight after Markham's arrest, I found him standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the street. The light was poor, and his profile looked unusually drawn. "You are brooding, Holmes," I said. "I thought the case was complete." "Complete?" he murmured. "Yes. In the way that a manuscript is complete when the final word is written, though one still hears the echo of the pen." He turned slowly, the faintest of smiles playing at his lips. "Tell me, Watson, what did you make of Wendell's final words at the hearing?" I cast my mind back. He said, "I built what he paid for. I never meant the girl to die." "Just so," Holmes said softly. "A craftsman's lament, perhaps sincere, and yet there is a note in it that troubles me. He built what he was paid for." "Did you observe his face when Markham was named the sole architect of the plot?" I nodded. He looked relieved, broken almost. "Relieved, yes," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "And something else. Surprised." He turned back to the window, as though he had expected another name to be uttered, and it was not. "That, Watson, is the burr." An unannounced visitor, our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's discreet knock. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says his business is urgent." The visitor was a nervous young clerk, no more than 23, with ink stains upon his fingers, and a collar 2 sizes too large. He bowed awkwardly and produced a folded letter. "I work for the Marble Bridge Committee, sir," he said. "I was asked to bring this at once. It arrived this morning addressed to the committee secretary, but well after the business with Mr. Markham, sir. They thought it best you should see it first." Holmes took the letter, thanked the clerk, and waited until the door had closed before unfolding it. The paper was heavy, the writing elegant, and precisely measured. He read it once, then again more slowly, his brow furrowing. "Well?" I asked. He handed it to me without a word. "To the esteemed members of the Marble Bridge Committee, I congratulate you on your recent triumph over the so-called ghost. Your lion's mouth has roared at last, though it took a cleverer hand than yours to teach it to sing. If you believe the curtain has fallen, you are mistaken. One player has exited the stage, but the theater remains. You have removed the mask, but not the hand that raised it. A friend of the river." The letter was unsigned. The script, though elegant, bore no distinguishing flourishes, and there was no watermark on the paper save the faint impression of a Thames watermark common to many stationers. I looked at Holmes. "A hoax, perhaps," he said, "or perhaps a hand we have not yet glimpsed." A visit to the bridge that evening, without informing Lestrade, Holmes insisted we walk once more to the Marble Bridge. The fog had returned not thickly, but in gentle veils that clung to the parapets and softened the lamps. London had begun to move on, the hawkers were gone, and only a few stragglers crossed the bridge, their steps echoing hollowly on the damp stone. Holmes walked slowly, tapping the parapet with his cane at intervals, like a man listening for hollow notes on a wall. When we reached the midpoint near the lion's mouth, he paused and crouched. "Here," he murmured. He directed my attention to the inner lip of the parapet. The scratches, wax residue, and pulley fittings had been removed by order of the yard. Yet just below, in a fine chalky line, someone had etched a small spiral, no bigger than a shilling. It was so faint it could easily have escaped notice. Holmes traced it with a gloved finger. "Not workman," he said. "A workman would have wiped it away without thought. This was left deliberately. A sign." "A sign of what?" He did not answer at once. "Do you recall, Watson, the thread found at Wendell's window? Pale, soft, like trimming?" "Yes. This spiral is marked with the same chalk dust finely ground marble. Whoever left this was no idle passerby. He knows the craft, perhaps even better than Wendell." Holmes's reflections. We walked home in thoughtful silence. Back at Baker Street, Holmes threw himself into his armchair and sat staring into the fire, pipe unlit, fingers steepled. His gaze had the far-off gleam it sometimes took when the next problem began to form, even before the last had entirely cooled. "Watson," he said at length, "do you remember what I told you at the beginning of this affair? That our ghost was a playwright, and Wendell his craftsman?" "Yes." He turned his head toward me slowly. "Then consider this. Playwrights sometimes work in companies. They share their stage, trade illusions, and learn from one another. The ghost of the Marble Bridge may have been only one performance in a longer run." I felt a chill. "You think someone else may attempt a similar scheme elsewhere?" He gave that slight, enigmatic smile that always left me half in admiration, half in unease. "I do not think so, Watson," I observed. And I have observed that clever men rarely build a single stage when the city offers them a dozen. A subtle restlessness in the weeks that followed. Holmes displayed none of his usual post-case indolence. He took no new clients, answered a few correspondences, and twice I caught him examining stationers' ledgers and samples of handwriting under his lens. When I asked what occupied him, he only said, merely ensuring that our friend of the river does not have brothers in the fog. For my part, I hoped the affair had truly ended. The ghost had been unmasked, Markham disgraced, Wendell exposed. Yet, as October deepened into November, and the fog grew heavier over London, I sometimes awoke in the small hours, and thought of the spiral on the bridges stone small, deliberate, and waiting. And in those moments I could almost hear, far below the city's endless murmur, the faintest whisper of steps upon the stone. Chapter the 12th. Epilogue. The Lion Sleeps winter came early that year. By mid-November, a steady mist hung over the Thames, clinging to the water like a living thing. The foghorns moaned through the cold nights, and the glow of the gas lamps bled softly into the gloom. London had turned its thoughts from ghosts to Parliament, from scandals to Christmas markets, and the ghost of the Marble Bridge had, for most, become a thrilling memory, already exaggerated in countless retellings. For Sherlock Holmes, however, the matter had never quite closed. I had grown accustomed, in the weeks that followed, to finding him at odd hours examining the spiral mark we had recorded, comparing it to sketches in his commonplace book, or cross-referencing handwriting samples in tradesmen's ledgers. Though no new incident had occurred, his attention was drawn repeatedly to the bridge, as if some note still hung unresolved in the melody. One frosty morning, as the city stirred sluggishly under a pale sun, a messenger arrived with a sealed note addressed to Holmes. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat but unadorned. Holmes slid it open with his penknife and read it twice before passing it to me without a word. Mr. Holmes, though the stage has emptied and the actors are gone, the theater remains. Do not imagine that the Marble Bridge is the only platform upon which a drama may unfold. I have watched your performance with interest. You are, if nothing else, a conductor who knows when to raise the lantern. Until the next curtain. The friend of the river. I looked up sharply. The same hand. Undoubtedly, Holmes said. His voice was calm, but there was that spark in his eye which I had learned to both admire and fear. He has not abandoned the stage. He merely waits for another night's performance. A visit in winter later that week, Holmes proposed that we walk to the Marble Bridge one final time. The day was crisp and bitterly cold, the sky a hard white, the river sluggish and dark. Few pedestrians braved the embankment in such weather. As we approached, I noted how different the bridge appeared in the clear air. Without the fog, the lions seemed merely decorative, their mouths gaping toward the river like bored sentries. The parapets were clean. The chalk spiral had been washed away by rain and city soot. Holmes leaned against the stone midway across the span, gazing down at the water where the ghost had once appeared. How thin the veil is, Watson, he said quietly, between a city's nerves and a city's imagination. A bit of wax, a rope, some chalk, a story, and thousands tremble. The ghost is gone now, I said. He gave a short, thoughtful hum. This ghost, yes. But London is full of bridges and fog. It takes little to awaken another. We stood in silence a long while, listening to the water lapping against the piers. A distant bell struck noon, its sound carrying through the crisp air with unusual clarity. For the first time in months, the bridge was utterly still. Even the pigeons perched motionless upon the lamps, feathers puffed against the cold. Lestrade's visit not long after our walk, Inspector Lestrade called at Baker Street. His manner was almost jovial, a rare thing in that usually hard-bitten man. It's all tidy now, Holmes, he said, settling into his chair. Markham's trial begins next month. Wendell's evidence has sealed it tight. Parliament's washing its hands of the business. But between you and me, they're grateful you caught the rat before he gnawed too far. Scotland Yard's reputation's recovered a bit too. Holmes inclined his head. I'm pleased to hear it. And this friend of the river nonsense, Lestrade added with a dismissive snort. Likely some wag from the printing office trying to stir up a sequel. These letters, bah. London's full of mischief makers. Holmes smiled faintly but said nothing. After Lestrade left, he remarked to me, the inspector is a competent man in his sphere, but he does not hear echoes, Watson. And it is in echoes that the truth often lingers. Watson's reflection in the quiet that followed the resolution of the case. I found myself reflecting often upon Miss Clara Lewes. Her life had been modest, her ambitions simple. She had entered the ghost story by accident, and paid the price of proximity to men who thought themselves authors of the world. Holmes spoke rarely of her, but on one evening I noticed him examining the glove we had recovered, turning it over in his long fingers with an expression that hovered somewhere between regret and contemplation. He placed it carefully back into his desk drawer, closed it, and said only, "Every mechanism has a human cost, Watson. It is best not to forget the weight behind the lever. One last lantern. Winter deepened. Snow fell over London in late December, muting the city's perpetual clamor. One night, returning late from a medical call in Westminster, I crossed the Marble Bridge alone. The fog had not yet risen, and the snow lay in thin, powdery sheets upon the parapet. My footsteps echoed strangely in the stillness. As I passed the Lion's Mouth, I paused. It looked ordinary, new cleaned, sealed, its hidden devices removed. And yet, standing there beneath the silent lamps, I felt again that strange tingle at the base of the neck, as though some unseen audience waited in the wings. On a sudden impulse, I took out my small medical lantern and turned its beam toward the river, just as Holmes had done that night. The light struck the water and scattered into faint, rippling gleams. There was nothing there. No ghosts, no cloak, no trap. Only the Thames, ancient and indifferent, flowing on. And yet, in that moment, I understood something Holmes had once said. London writes its own stories. Men like Markham merely borrow the pen. I lowered the lantern, buttoned my coat against the cold, and walked on. Baker Street, Christmas Eve on Christmas Eve. As the fire burned low and snow gathered softly upon the sill, Holmes and I sat in easy silence. He was stretched upon the settee, pipe in hand, eyes half-lidded, listening to some inward music. I was writing up my notes of the case, the final passages you now read. Holmes broke the quiet suddenly. Watson. Yes, Holmes. When the lion sleeps, the bridge does not cease to stand. I looked at him quizzically. A poetic mood, Holmes? He gave the faintest smile. Merely an observation. And then he returned to his reverie, leaving me to the scratching of my pen and the quiet crackle of the fire. Watson's closing note thus ended the affair of the ghost of the Marble Bridge, an affair that began with fog and fear and concluded with clear air and quiet water. The ghost was no specter, but a mirror held up to London's imagination. Its true power lay not in ropes or wax, but in the stories whispered from mouth to mouth, gathering weight as the mist gathered over the river. Markham's trial would, in due course, grip the city once more. Wendell would vanish into some anonymous provincial town after his release, and the spiral mark, faint, deliberate, would remain in my mind as a sign that not all mysteries end neatly. Holmes, as ever, moved on to new problems. But I, who chronicle his adventures, find myself returning often in memory to that bridge on a foggy night, the beam of a lantern slicing through mist, and the sudden knowledge that the ghost was a man all along. And somewhere, perhaps upon another bridge, in another fog, another hand may yet raise the curtain. Chapter the 13th. Postscript. The trial at the Old Bailey. It is my habit, in recounting those adventures I shared with Sherlock Holmes, to end my narrative with the resolution of the mystery itself. Yet some cases, by their very nature, extend beyond the shadows of the fog-bound street and the midnight pursuit. They reach into the courts of law, the newspapers, and even the minds of men, lingering like faint echoes long after the principal actors have departed. The ghost of the Marble Bridge was such a case. The trial of Edward Markham on a damp February morning, 3 months after the events at the bridge. London thronged the streets near the Old Bailey, as though attending a theatre premiere. Edward Markham, MP, once a respected figure in Parliament and society, stood accused of conspiracy to defraud, accessory to manslaughter, and public endangerment. The trial promised scandal, spectacle, and, as one newspaper delicately phrased it, a lantern held to the murkier recesses of ambition. I obtained a seat in the gallery beside Lestrade and several members of the press. Holmes declined to attend the opening day. "The performance holds no novelty for me, Watson," he remarked. "I read the script weeks ago, but I went nonetheless, curious to witness the public unmasking of a man who had once hidden so cleverly behind the fog." Markham entered the dock still carrying something of his old bearing, tall, well-dressed, with that air of entitlement which years of privilege confer. Yet his face was drawn, the ruddy complexion had given way to a pallor that bespoke sleepless nights. He glanced toward the gallery once coldly, defiantly, and then stared straight ahead. The prosecution's opening statement was clear and devastating. Piece by piece, they laid out the mechanics of the ghost, the waxed cords, the lion's mouth, the pulley rings, Wendell's confession, and the pattern of land purchases made quietly through Markham's associates. Holmes's meticulous notes, passed to the yard after the arrests, formed the backbone of the case. His diagrams of the mechanism were reproduced before the court, causing audible murmurs as the jurors grasped for the first time how something so simple could have created such elaborate terror. Wendell's testimony. Albert Wendell, pale and subdued, was brought to the stand on the second day. His testimony was painfully thorough. He recounted his recruitment by Markham under the guise of an urban art installation, his work upon the lions, the construction of the pulley devices, and the rehearsals in the fog. His voice shook when he described the night Miss Clara Lewes died. "I thought she was to be frightened away," he said, "not God help me, not thrown." Markham's counsel tried to paint Wendell as the mastermind, suggesting that Markham had been merely duped into funding a decorative experiment gone awry. Wendell's evident remorse and the overwhelming physical evidence, however, made the argument sound hollow. Holmes had foreseen this tactic. Every mechanical detail had been documented, leaving no room for ambiguity as to who had the motive. Holmes takes the stand on the fourth day. Holmes was called to give evidence. I confess that, even after years of companionship, I still felt a small thrill at seeing him under oath, the cool authority of his manner making the barristers look like schoolboys fumbling for their notes. "Mr. Holmes," the prosecutor began, "you have been described as the person chiefly responsible for unraveling this conspiracy. Would you be so good as to explain, in your own words, how you came to your conclusions?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I did nothing remarkable. I merely observed what was before me and refused to be distracted by what was not." He then gave, in his calm, measured way, the entire sequence of deductions, beginning with the wax smear on the parapet and ending with Markham's apprehension beneath the bridge. He spoke as though reading a chemical formula, and yet every word held the court rapt. When the defense attempted to trip him with questions about his methods, he dismantled their arguments with the same patient, surgical precision he might apply to a microscope slide. At one point, the defense barrister asked, with a hint of mockery, "Mr. Holmes, are you telling this court that you deduced all of this from a smear of wax and a glove?" Holmes looked at him with faint amusement. "Yes," he said simply, "and from the fact that men lie, but stone does not." A rustle went through the courtroom like a breeze through dry leaves. Verdict and sentence. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Markham was found guilty on all counts, and though his position spared him the gallows, he received a sentence of 15 years penal servitude. The announcement struck the city like a thunderclap. An MP in chains was not an everyday sight. His name was struck from the rolls, his estates seized to repay defrauded investors. I remember watching him as the verdict was read. He did not shout or collapse. He simply stared ahead, as if the fog he had once commanded had finally swallowed him whole. Wendell was sentenced separately. In light of his cooperation and lack of murderous intent, he received a short term of imprisonment followed by exile from London's trade guilds. I heard later that he took work in a small provincial town near Bristol, carving church ornaments, a ghost of his former theatrical self. The bridge afterward, the marble bridge, endured. Once its ghost had been exorcised, the city slowly reclaimed it. New lamps were installed, the lions' mouths were inspected monthly, and a small bronze plaque was mounted near the midpoint, warning against tampering with the drainage channels. The fog continued to roll across it each winter, indifferent to the human drama it had once staged. Curiously, the spiral mark Holmes had discovered was never traced. No further letters arrived from the friend of the river, though Holmes continued, from time to time, to receive curious bits of anonymous correspondence, cryptic remarks, odd sketches, occasional scraps of marble dust paper. He never said much about them, but I often caught him examining them late at night, a faint speculative smile upon his lips. Watson's closing reflection. In the months following the trial, London found new scandals, new hauntings, new fascinations. The story of the ghost of the marble bridge slipped gradually from the front pages into the anecdotal corners of society, the sort of tale recounted over dinner to impress guests from the country. "Do you remember," people would say, "when the lion on the bridge swallowed policeman whole?" For me, it remained more than an anecdote. It was a case that revealed something quintessential about London herself, a city that writes myths as readily as minutes, whose bridges can be stages, whose fog can conceal both murder and make-believe. It showed how a handful of clever men, armed with nothing more than chalk, wax, rope, and greed, could bend public fear into a weapon, and how one clear mind could cut through that fog like a lantern beam. Holmes never called it one of his great cases. Too theatrical, he once remarked. It depended less on intellect than on the public's willingness to be deceived. But in my own estimation, it revealed as much about him as it did about the criminals. His ability to remain still when others panicked, to see through illusion, and to understand that beneath London's endless stories, there is always a hand pulling the cord. Baker Street, early spring. One evening in early spring, as I sat by the fire writing these final notes, Holmes looked up from a letter he had been studying and said, almost absently, "Watson, do you ever wonder how many lions there are in London?" I repeated, puzzled. "Yes," he said, "stone lions, iron lions, gargoyles and carvings and fountains. Hundreds, perhaps, each with a mouth, each with a hollow throat. Each is a potential stage." He smiled faintly at my expression. "Never mind, the lion sleeps, for now." And with that, he returned to his violin, drawing from it a low, contemplative tune that lingered in the air long after I had set down my pen.